Coming up next, a House Telecommunications and Finance Subcommittee panel on broadcasting and political advertising. During this hearing in June, the subcommittee examined proposals that would require radio and TV networks to offer candidates low rates for political ads. Committee members discussed the ways that such proposals would fit into a reform of the campaign finance system. The witnesses included former chairman of the Republican and Democratic National Committees, as well as political consultants Robert Squire and Roger Ailes. First, the subcommittee heard from Representative Sam Gadenson, chairman of the House Campaign Finance Reform Task Force.
Good morning. Today we are examining the need to reform the process by which congressional candidates purchase television time for their campaigns and thus communicate to the voting public. The explosion in the costs of campaigns in recent years, with rising television costs weighing heavily, makes this issue a very important piece of the broader debate over campaign finance reform. The purpose of this hearing is not to lay the blame for current woes, but to lay the foundation for future benefits. In that regard, I also want to commend the tremendous efforts of the House Administration Task Force on Campaign Finance Reform, chaired by Mr. Gadenson, our first witness today. All of us in public life must be sobered by recent trends in the public's perception of and participation in electoral politics. A recent study by the Markle Commission on the Media and the Electorate found that, quote, American voters do not seem to understand their rightful place in the operation of American democracy and see themselves as, quote, distant outsiders with little personal consequences at stake. Last year, 64% of eligible voters failed to participate in the midterm congressional elections. Thus, at a time when our country should be an exemplary beacon of light leading the way for the world's newly emerging democracies, we may be threatened by dim participation in our own electoral process. Clearly, many factors have contributed to the perception of disenchantment with voters, from the decline in the strength of political parties to the attention focused on the power of political action committees and the burdens of fundraising. But as the single most powerful form of communication today, television's role as a medium for speaking to voters is crucial. The agreement to purchase airtime made between a political candidate and a television or radio station is more than a private contract between individuals or corporations. Because broadcasters operate through the use of the public airwaves, they assume the legal responsibility of safeguarding the public interest. As part of this subcommittee's continuing oversight of the effectiveness of broadcasters in meeting their public interest responsibilities, we have to assure that we have a fair and effective system through which candidates communicate their ideas. On the other hand, given the growing competitive pressures on broadcasters from cable and video sources, we must assume that for our solution with respect to the importance of free over-the-air television in the provision of information to the public, that we have acted wisely. Last year, the Energy and Commerce Committee reported out a bill sponsored by Chairman Dingell that would have made the first adjustment in the definition of lowest unit rate for campaign advertising since 1972. This legislation would have required broadcasters to sell political candidates fixed and non-preemptible spots at their lowest preemptible rate. Our goal in pursuing that bill was to provide a fairer playing field for all candidates who depend upon the media to communicate in their campaigns. While I hope to work closely again this year with Chairman Dingell and Task Force Chairman Gadenson on the lowest unit rate provision, there are related measures before the House which will be open for discussion at today's hearing. These include the proposal adopted by the Senate and included in Mr. Sinar's legislation, which would cut the cost of airtime for qualifying candidates to 50% for general elections, proposals by Mr. Bliley and others for the provision of free time to candidates, and a range of proposals that focus on the accountability of candidates and independent expenditures through mandatory candidate appearance or labeling. All of these proposals deserve our attention, and I look forward to the views of witnesses on these subjects. In addition to Chairman Gadenson, we have an extraordinarily distinguished assembly of witnesses, including a panel of Paul Kirk and William Brock, former respective chairmen of the Democrat and Republican National Committees, along with Roger Ailes and Robert Squire, experienced political consultants. On the next panel, we have Norman Ornstein of the American Enterprise Institute, Fred Wertheimer of Common Cause, and Jerry Fritz of All Britain Communications. I look forward to an illuminating discussion by all of our witnesses. That concludes the opening statement of the Chair. We now turn to recognize the ranking minority member, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Rinaldo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Campaign reform is one of the most important and probably highly publicized issues in the 102nd Congress. I want to certainly thank you for scheduling an outstanding panel of expert witnesses as we address just one element of campaign finance reform, political advertising on broadcast stations. Broadcast television is the primary means through which Americans receive their news and information, and Congress has appropriately sought to ensure that candidates for public office have access to broadcast stations. It's essential to a fair, efficient, democratic process. For nearly 40 years, Section 315 of the Communications Act has been the means by which candidates receive that access at fair and equitable rates for both the candidate and the broadcaster. In 1972, Congress amended Section 315 to provide that candidates were billed the lowest unit rate or charge, otherwise known as the LUC. The LUC, in theory, ensures that 45 days prior to a primary and 60 days prior to a general election, candidates will be treated as favorably as commercial advertisers. In practice, however, that is not working. In an audit released last September, the FCC concluded that candidates still pay higher rates than commercial advertisers. In effect, the lowest unit charge isn't really the lowest charge anymore. Near the end of the last session, Chairman Dingell, Congressman Lent, Chairman Markey, and I introduced legislation to amend the law so that broadcasters could charge candidates only the lowest charge of the station. In short, this bipartisan bill, which had the support of the broadcasting industry, guaranteed that candidates would be charged non-preemptible rates similar to stations' most favored commercial advertiser. Unfortunately, Congress adjourned without approving that legislation. Today, several proposals are pending before our subcommittee. Some offer significant departures from existing practice, such as providing candidates with free broadcast time. Other proposals, such as the recently passed Senate bill, take a different approach by requiring broadcasters to charge eligible candidates only 50% of the LUC between the primary and general elections. The FCC also has decided to act. Today, it will issue a notice of proposed rulemaking that seeks to clarify the lowest unit charge prior to the 1992 election cycle. Whether the FCC's rulemaking will obviate the need for congressional action remains to be seen. The issue of campaign reform is tremendously difficult, and we are, in reality, only dealing with one aspect of it in this morning's hearing. But it is an important element, probably the most expensive part of a campaign, and it is one that needs to be addressed. Let me just say that it's essential that we do something in this area. My own campaign reform effort goes back to my first term in the House of Representatives when I sponsored the Udall-Anderson bill. I'm currently a sponsor of H.R. 1177, the Fair and Clean Election Act, which has been endorsed by Common Cause. I hope that in this Congress we can finally make some progress toward bipartisan agreement on reforms to the law. I want to, Mr. Chairman, especially welcome our witnesses this morning, the former chairman of the RNC and my good friend, former Senator Bill Brock, and certainly the former chairman of the Democratic National Committee and my good friend Paul Kirk. We will be hearing this morning from some of the most noted experts in the campaign field, and I'm certain that this hearing will help us develop a more informed record on which to continue our deliberations. That concludes my opening statement, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Any other members seeking recognition for the purpose of making an opening statement? Chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cooper.
I thank the Chair. I have no opening statement, but I would like to ask unanimous consent to insert the statement of our colleague, Congressman Bart Gordon, on his bill, H.R. 483.
Without objection, his statement will be inserted in the record at the appropriate point. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Bliley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This morning we are addressing what I believe to be an overlooked element of the campaign finance reform debate. Last year I introduced and this Congress reintroduced H.R. 2161, the Political Broadcasting Access Act of 1990. I did this as an attempt to address one aspect of the cost of political campaigns, the cost of broadcast advertising. I do not claim this to be an original idea. It was first raised by Dr. Larry Sabato of the University of Virginia in his 1989 book entitled Paying for Elections, The Campaign Finance Thicket. Unfortunately, Dr. Sabato was unable to testify this morning. H.R. 2161 would require each broadcast licensee to provide 8 hours of free time to political parties. This time would be equally divided between the two parties, with 2 hours going to the national parties and 2 hours to state parties. Additionally, third parties who receive more than 5% in the preceding presidential election would be eligible to receive a portion of the 8 hours determined by their level of support. Finally, H.R. 2161 would require each cable franchise in the nation to make the same amount of time available. As you are probably aware, last year the Senate's Bipartisan Commission on Campaign Reform, of which Dr. Sabato was a member, included a similar proposal in its recommendations. I do not intend to suggest that this proposal by itself is a complete answer to the difficult question of campaign reform. This proposal does address what I believe to be the key issue for any challenger, having the resources to get his or her message out to the voting public. Like it or not, the vehicle for doing that is the broadcast media. Clearly, the broadcasters are not fond of this proposal. I would remind my colleagues that broadcasters have free, exclusive use of the spectrum on which they make millions of dollars. This is not a high price to ask in return for the use of a scarce public resource. Public's concern over campaign finance reform has less to do with who contributes and how much than it does with the basic concern that the deck is stacked in favor of those in power. Giving parties the ability to give the poorest of challenges with a message, the opportunity to communicate it to the voters, will do more to increase competition and the public's confidence in the fairness of the system than anything else. I welcome the comments and suggestions of the panel on the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, gentleman's time has expired. Are there any other members seeking recognition for the purpose of making an opening statement? Chair will recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Bryant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that what I referred to is perhaps not exactly within the topics that the chairman considered when he was thinking about having this hearing today, but I wanted to make mention of it anyway because I think it's at least tangentially related. And that is, I think, a proposal that was introduced in the Senate last year. I introduced it in the House as well, and I've raised it a number of times in our informal meetings with regard to campaign finance reform, and that is trying to deal with the ultimate problem, and that is the need for money. It occurs to me that one way to deal with it is to recognize that there is something inherently dishonest in the practice that each of us have been required to follow, both Republicans and Democrats, of hiring expensive consultants, some of which are in the room, and all of whom are good friends, and there are many of them who are not here that are good friends as well, but hiring them to create television ads which allow us to call our opponents scoundrels without appearing to have been the one that called him a scoundrel or her, or helping us to create TV ads which make us appear to be greatly virtuous and greatly wise, perhaps beyond our true virtues and wisdom. without it appearing that we are the ones that said we are virtuous and wise. And I think there's something inherently dishonest about that. It occurs to me that we ought to consider legislation as part of the campaign finance reform package that says if you want to use the television, you may do so, as long as it is you on the television who is talking. You can't hire somebody to call your opponent a liar and a scoundrel for you, or to find a subtle way to insinuate that your opponent is a liar or a scoundrel. Nor can you hire someone to suggest to the public that you are greater than you really are. If your virtues are indeed what you say they are, then you can go on the television and say it. If you believe that this nation ought to adopt a different course with regard to policy, then you ought to go on the television and say it. And if you believe your opponent is a scoundrel and a liar, then you ought to go on the television and say it. And if you don't have the courage to say it, or you think it would reflect badly upon you to say it, then it ought not to be said in the first place. I think it's constitutional to place a limitation on the use of television and radio in that regard. That's a debate for another time. I certainly think it would be in the interest of honesty in American politics, and it would be right, and it would save all of us a whole lot of money. We wouldn't have to raise as much, and we wouldn't have to go to such enormous lengths as we're going to have to go to find creative ways to raise money under whatever form of campaign finance reform bill we finally pass. So I throw that out for consideration of the witnesses today and hope we can hear a little talk about it.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and along with my other colleagues, I commend you for holding this hearing. I have a more complete statement to be inserted in the record with unanimous consent, but would also endorse the comments of Mr. Bryant of Texas. We concentrate on this issue of spending, and yes, it is significant, and we all want campaign reform, and it's just merely a matter of which version, and I guess we just don't like any one version any more than any others. But basically, every version that I have seen has to do with the dollars and the spending. And as significant as that is, I frankly think that the points made by Mr. Bryant are even more significant, and I hope that this committee can take a lead in those areas. Thank you, sir.
Great. Time for opening statements. Any other members seeking recognition? Time for opening statements by members has been completed, and we'll now turn to our first witness, the Honorable Sam Gadenson from the state of Connecticut, excuse me, who is the chairman of the task force responsible for putting together a package of campaign reforms this year. It's a Gordian knot of monumental proportions, and I think that the Speaker appointed the right man for the job, if it's possible to do this job in this Congress. And Sam, we're looking forward to your testimony, and please, whenever you feel comfortable, begin.
Thank you. I'd place my entire statement in the record.
Could you turn on the microphone, please? Down below.
Oh, it switches here. All right. Thank you. I'd ask unanimous consent to place my entire statement in the record.
Without objection, it will be inserted in the record.
Thank you. And just try to summarize and answer some questions. First, with the voter turnout, it seems to me outrageous that as a country who runs around the world demanding that there be open democracy, that we have among some of the most restrictive voter registration procedures in the world for democracies. And one thing that could be done easily by this Congress, not necessarily before your or my committee's jurisdiction, is to provide for universal voter registration. If people move around as much as they do today, Mr. Bliley and I both have districts with significant Navy enlisted people in it. 20–30% of the district's populations changes in a relatively short period of time. The town hall is no longer as familiar today as it was to people, so that when you end up with almost half the people not registered, it makes the entire process more difficult. So I think, we as a Congress ought to move quickly on universal registration to make sure at least there's no obstacle for people getting there. And oftentimes the public doesn't get excited about the race till the last 10 or 12 days, and that's often past the deadline for registering in many districts. There are significant changes in what television is doing to campaigns, and part of it isn't clear yet. As cable TV covers almost our universal constituency, it's oftentimes more difficult to figure out if the television ad you're placing on a show, whether it's 60 Minutes or some local show, is actually going to be watched by your constituents, or they're going to watch it on an out-of-state broadcast by that same network on a different channel. Additionally, we all start off with kind of a bias thinking that television commercials are the most expensive part of campaigns and that they're universally used. They may be universally used in the Senate, and that's why the Senate, I think, spends more time focusing on television costs than the House has traditionally. And some of our colleagues end up with this misimpression as well, that there are proposals to say, okay, we're going to have the amount of money you can spend on campaign based on the cost of television in your district. So our staff went out and did a little digging, and we found that the district with the 70th most expensive television market ended up spending the most money, and that in reality only about a third of congressional districts and campaigns end up using television, and of the third that use television in their campaigns, what we find is it's only 25 to 30% of the money that they spend throughout the campaign. Now, it does have a significant proportional impact, I think, in those races, and for that reason, it does make sense to address what we pay for television. And I think I was as surprised as many people were to find out that television stations that do these great editorials about the cost of campaigns weren't always following the spirit of the law in the lowest unit rate costs, and you'd find that buyers are fighting with local TV stations trying to get what I think all of us considered the law to be. And so what you're doing here, I think, is important, but I think we also have to remember that television doesn't affect every congressional race in the same way. The races in the most expensive markets may spend nothing on television, and races in less expensive markets, the 23rd, the 30th, and the 60th, may end up using television to a far greater degree. I think we really want to see candidates run their own campaigns, so that I think at some point you step over a line by enticing candidates to use TV where it was never used before. I'm not sure that there's been a scientific study that says television elevates the debate in a campaign. It may not, but certainly I think our role as members of Congress shouldn't be to say, yes, everything else in society costs you $1, but we're going to give you 2 ads for every one you buy or what have you, and make television cost 2/3 of $1 or 1/3 of $1. Let the candidate have his money or her money and decide how they're going to spend it. Let's make sure they get a fair deal from the broadcasters to make sure they're not being charged more than a steady business customer would be used, and let's maybe use the license as a leverage to get that, or whatever approach you choose. But it seems to me that our goal here as a Congress shouldn't be to move television into campaigns where it presently isn't used. Maybe direct mail makes as good or a better debate. Maybe the lack of television means that the local television stations cover it. Maybe lawn signs are the best things to use in your district, or standing on street corners campaigning if you have a very compact district, or one where there are places where people congregate. So I think we want to be careful not to kind of add television to districts that presently don't use television. Free television time would frankly work in Connecticut, where the several major stations reach virtually the entire state, and with cable do reach the entire state. And if you use news adjacency, you're probably getting most of the people that vote in the election. But if your district is the center of Manhattan, and Channel 9, which I guess is physically located in New Jersey, reaches 40 congressional districts, it is priced that even at half its present cost or a quarter of its present cost, it's a ludicrous expenditure for somebody who's running for Congress. And so, given our choice, and one of the things we're looking at in the task force is to tax advertising. And I know that puts some political shudders around in this town, but the reality is that what we're talking about is getting our message out, and let the candidates decide whether they want to advertise in newspapers or television or radio or maybe even direct mail. 0.25% on advertising in this country would raise more money than we need for public financing of campaigns in any real sense, and we probably have some money left over to reduce the deficit. I think what you're doing makes a lot of sense, because what's happened is that different candidates around this country are dealt with differently, in that stations have implemented the law in a variety of ways. My one concern with our friend Mr. Bliley's proposal on giving parties money, and I end up getting accused of being anti-party in this process, is that like separation of church and state, it seems to me we all kind of fall back in this comfortable situation. We say, well, we'll give a little money to the Democrats and we'll give a little to the Republicans and they'll get their various messages out, and that's not bad. I'm not sure that's the taxpayer's responsibility, first of all. And second of all, what do you do when, if Reverend Jones had not killed all his flock in Guyana, and he came back and instead of a religion decided to start a political party? And yes, indeed, he got enough signatures or what have you. Do you think the taxpayers ought to subsidize these parties? I think it's a threshold question, whether it's the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, or any other party. Maybe the parties have to kind of earn, in the old-fashioned way, the support that they desire. And let's not create a system that rigs it against political parties, but I'm not sure that it's our role as a Congress to kind of hand a subsidy system to political parties. And we might even sit around the circle and say, well, we're all on the inside, we're all Democrats and Republicans, let's subsidize our parties. I don't think you could say that. I think you'd have to say if the Communist Party came along or the Fascist Party came along or the, whatever party came along, you'd have to have the same rules for them. I'm not sure that that's a goal for this society, that parties ought to make it on their own more, and maybe we can find ways to make the system more neutral to them. Some argue that the existing laws damage parties, and we shouldn't be doing that either, but I'm not sure we ought to be ones to nurture. Let me again commend you. I will give you, and we can get each of your members, a copy of this brief review where we went through media market by media market and looked at the cost of campaigns for winners and losers. And there is no correlation that we can find as far as the expense of the district and the amount of money spent in the campaign or on TV. It may be an inverse relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, very much. Let me just ask a quick question, if I could. Last year, this committee reported out a bill which redefined lowest unit rate, and that's as far as we went. Are there any other recommendations which you would make to us that would reform the broadcasting area in terms of its relationship with campaigns?
I think that you've got to take a look at proposals like Mr. Bryant's and others, and it's a very tough area to cross. Some people have come before our committee. We've had about 100 witnesses and 10 hearings, and come forward with 1/3 of the ad has to have the candidate's picture, or if you're talking about a 30-second commercial, to try to get us to say something substantive in the time we have allotted and blurt out at the end, paid for by Gaydens and for Congress or what have you, is tough enough. We don't want to make the commercials less substantive as we try to do more kind of warnings. This could be dangerous to your health. So I think you got to take a look at proposals like Mr. Bryant's and others that try to deal with negative campaigns and content, but you really got to think it through. And for our part on our committee, what we're trying to do more is to set up a structure of how the campaign process works, limits on spending, PACs, non-PAC money, public financing, and we'd look to you and we'd be happy to have our staff work with you. But they're not easy answers. Every time you take a step off, you add considerable complications. You could end up with a 30-second commercial with about 15 seconds of what you're saying and about 15 seconds of disclaimers if you're not careful.
Any other members wishing to ask questions? Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Bliley.
Sam, I appreciate your comments. In the legislation, it does provide for the Reverend Jones, as you mentioned, or some other party. If they got 5% of the vote in the last election, they would share in this time, 8 hours. If you don't have the parties control it, how would you do it on an equitable basis? That's
it's a good consideration. I mean, it certainly has some logic to it from the perspective that the party could then allocate time, not for the guy who's running for re-election in a safe Republican or Democratic district, but use it where there's a real battle and there'd be that certainly has some merit to it. My concern comes from the perspective that says, do we as taxpayers want to nurture any particular political philosophy or ideology? Okay, now I've got 5%. Do we want the taxpayers subsidizing
But we have
my
al-
particular philosophy?
We've already crossed that Rubicon in the presidential election. I mean,
Well,
Yeah.
what we're doing, you're right there, and what we're doing there is taking a candidate in his, and with what he stands for and helping the candidate. That's one thing. Do you want to help political organizations? That's another consideration. Now, for instance, the President of the United States says, and he's signed up for $150 million worth of public funds, he will next January sign up for another $46 or $50 million worth of public funding, but he says for Congress and the Senate, he's against public funding. And so I think each one of these steps have to be taken one at a time. I disagree with the President, by the way. And what I would say is, if it's candidates, let them earn their support because they have a platform out. It's a relatively short period thing. If it's parties, it's got to be another look. And I'm just not sure yet whether I'd want to see my tax dollars or the process that I'm part of subsidizing political philosophies to that degree. And it's a hard call.
Well, thank you, but on the public financing, I think the polls will tell us that the people don't think any more of that than they do on pay raises.
There's no question about it. One, if you ask the public on helping parties, they'd be against that too. If you ask the public on how Congress should be paid, they'd pick honorarium over the public treasury. I think what we've got to do here is try to do something that deals with the problems we have, that tries to rebuild confidence in the system, and that's going to take doing some things that may take some political courage. There's no question about it. It is not easy, to do these things. The proposal you have before your committee can very easily be turned on its head to say, well, Congressman Markey and panel, what you're trying to do is make it easier for politicians, incumbents and challengers. Well, that's part of democracy, and sometimes we got to take those steps that people may think help us, but I think help the process in reality.
Thank you, Sam.
Has expired. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilaracis.
Just very quickly, Mr. Chairman, well, Sam, as we know, and certainly in the case of Reverend Jones, this would be true, the candidate is the party. The candidate espouses all of the philosophy of the party, if you will. So you would not have the taxpayers subsidize the party, but you would have them subsidize Reverend Jones?
I think I guess where I draw the line is once you get on the ballot. If you're actually on the ballot and you're a candidate for public office, then I see public financing as a mitigation in the sense that it brings some money to the system that isn't from focused, energized groups. People distinguish between PACs and individual contributions. The reality is most of those are from people energized about some political issue. They come and they contribute to political parties. I look at public financing as representing the average citizen so that some money can come to the system that isn't just from some organized and exercised group in the public. They're on the ballot. That choice is going to be made. Let's get the people to know as well as we can those particular candidates. When it comes to parties, I think it's a lot harder to make that argument because what you then are supporting is a bureaucracy, a structure. It may make sense, it may not, but it's a different call. It is one step further. It's a step I'm not yet ready to take.
Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you,
Gentleman's time has expired. Very briefly, if we could, the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Richardson.
Mr. Gadenson has worked very hard on this issue, and I just want to ask him a question looking into a crystal ball. Are we going to have campaign finance reform this calendar year, given what the Senate has done and what you're preparing? And if so, very briefly, what might that final outcome be?
If I had a crystal ball, I might be in a different business, but let me say, I think we are going to have campaign finance reform. I think there is, people get worried about whether these two bills, a House bill and Senate bill, will match. I don't think it's as important as a lot of people argue. The Senate's a different institution. If you look at the Senate, here we get about a third of the members of Congress using television. Virtually every Senate race, I frankly don't know of a Senate race that doesn't use television. After the next reapportionment, there will be Senate districts, which are 52 times the size of a congressional district. So there are going to be some differences. I think we can live with that. We live with differences in the rules continuously, and I think we can live with differences in the Senate. The Senate ought to get what they want. They passed a bill, and I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that we don't take away from how the Senate believes Senate campaigns ought to be run. On the House, I think there are some differences. I think what the people want, and I think what makes sense, is first of all a limit on spending. the money chase, not where the money comes from, but the amount of time that challengers and incumbents spend on raising money, I think is a problem, just from how we apportion time, whether it's the job or the family. We've looked at the overall medium races, and we figure it's about 600,000, takes care of virtually every contested race. There'll clearly be some out of that. I think a balance of about a third, a third, a third makes sense. A third PAC money, a third of the money coming from large contributors, and a third of the money either from small contributors or some form of public financing. I'd get the money either through a voluntary checkoff, a 1% tax on gambling, or a 0.25% tax on advertising, all advertising, newspaper, radio, and television, so the television, news, and radio guys can't come to this committee and say we're being discriminated against. That's not a crystal ball. That's about where I am now. Obviously, we've got to work with the full committee and then with our colleagues in the Congress, trying to accommodate vast differences, everything from some places that have primaries in March to those that have primaries in September, those that have runoffs, and essentially have 3 elections. So that's what we're looking at.
Gentleman's time has expired. Sam, we want to work with you. I think the Speaker has given you the toughest job that any member has over the next session. We want to work with you in the broadcasting area. We know it's central in terms of any of the reforms that have to take place. And if you have any other recommendations to us in addition to lowest unit rate, we want to work with you this year on an expeditious fashion. But no question, you're the right man for the job.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, gentleman. I'm sorry, gentleman from
the little guy is hard to spot.
Gentleman from
sitting down.
Gentleman from Maryland, Mr. McMillan.
I was curious, just for the record, what would be the consequences in your view with regards to the PAC elimination in the Senate proposal? If that occurred, what do you think would be the consequences of that?
Well, I think that even most senators will admit to you they think that's not constitutional, so that what would happen is either a portion or the entire bill would get thrown out by the court. So I think we're asking for a little trouble that way. It is frankly something everybody, as I believe the chairman of this committee does, can do voluntarily if you're offended by political action. I think the consequences in our society is that you will leave the system more tilted towards the rich. So what would happen is that the board, if you look at the Exxon Valdez and the political players in that, the chairman of the board of Exxon and his board members could still get together on a Monday morning and say, well, you know, this Congressman X is somebody who supports our views. We ought to help him. Everybody ought to write a $1,000 personal check to him. Pretty easy to accomplish. The workers in that system would no longer be able to have their voice, whether it's on safety or health issues, heard, because you're not going to convince a worker that his $3 a year is going to have an impact on the political process. The Wilderness Society and the Sierra Club would also be excluded. So you would end up with the wealthiest individuals, almost going back to the pre-1974 situation, having a disproportionate and growing share of the political power in this country.
What would it mean in terms of time for members of Congress and candidates raising money?
I think they'd obviously have to spend more time raising money. I think it would leave this, you know, I guess the question that I ask on that area is, do you think that rich people have too little power in this country? Because if you look at what political action committees do, is they give little people a chance to join together. Now, I think what you want to avoid is letting the political landscape be dominated by political action committees. And I think that's part of the real problem that people look at today. You don't want to end up with 3/4 of your money coming from political action committees. You don't want your money coming 3/4 from millionaires. You want to have a broad spread of where the money comes from, some public, some private, some organized.
Thank you.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
Sam, thank you so
Anytime.
much. You're the greatest. Let's go then to our first panel, which is a very distinguished one, and in fact answers the question, whatever happened to bipartisanism, because to put this kind of a panel together requires, at least for this morning, for them to set aside their past, present, and future differences of opinion over who should be running the country, to help us to formulate some kind of a sense of what the ground rules should be for the 1990s in terms of how campaigns should be run. And I would hope that the committee, on a bipartisan fashion, would extend the courtesy to each of the people who are seated at the witness table, recognizing that from each side of the aisle, we would have differences of opinion in a dramatic way with the other side's witnesses here today, and would hope that each member of the subcommittee would respect the courtesy that the witnesses are extending to us by offering their expertise to us today. So let us then recognize our witnesses. Paul Kirk, the immediate past chairman of the National Democratic Committee, the Honorable William Brock, the former member of Congress and the U.S. Senate, and former chairman of the Republican National Committee, Mr. Roger Ailes of Ailes Communications, Inc., and Mr. Robert Squire of Squire SQ Knapp Communications. Let's begin with you, Mr. Kirk, if you would. Whenever you feel comfortable, you can flip on that switch down there, pull the microphone up, and please begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and members of the subcommittee for the invitation to appear before you this morning to speak to the important issue of campaign and finance and advertising reform. And I commend the subcommittee for taking this initiative to look for ways to improve our political process, and I might say in the subjects that are being covered by this subcommittee, it's my belief that they do indeed need improvement. As the chairman mentioned, since our last national election here in the United States, headlines in country after country across the globe have proclaimed the change to democracy and the bringing about of, perhaps for the first time in these regions, free elections. Millions have stood in line for the first time to exercise their right to vote. And here at home, in the most advanced democracy in the world, our elections have always been free. In our most recent national election, we witnessed an embarrassing 50% voter turnout, the lowest voter participation in a national election of any democracy in the world. And last year, in our midterm election, 64% of our eligible voters, those to whom this system belongs, chose not to exercise the highest responsibility of a free citizen. As we begin the 1990s, the sad fact is that our political system is choking on voter cynicism, indifference, and irrelevance. In my view, Mr. Chairman, our citizens are turning off and tuning out rather than turning out to vote. Negativism and technique have become the most dominant campaign messages. Avoidance is the substitute for accountability in campaigns. Sound bites for substance, polls for principles. Consultants, spin doctors, fat cats, and photo opportunities have replaced true principled campaign dialogue, party leadership, and party platforms in the perception of most voters. In short, the message of modern campaigns are becoming less relevant to the concerns of average American families. And the cost of conveying those irrelevant messages are increasing so greatly that voters believe that the process belongs to others and not to them. The blame must be shared by all of us: politicians, the press, the public, even our educators. Legislation will not provide all the solution, and this subcommittee cannot legislate all the reforms that are needed. But it is heartening that we are paying attention to the need for change. I will confine my brief comments this morning, Mr. Chairman, to the areas of cost and content. As to the cost of political campaigns, I agree with the observation of Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell, who said, and I quote, "There can be no meaningful reform without spending limits," close quote. The costs of political campaigns are out of control. When voters hear the amounts of money being spent, they assume the process is for sale. Raising the amounts of money needed for modern campaigns is demeaning and distracting for the candidates, and if I may say so, for many it is disgusting to the public. To a great degree, particularly in statewide campaigns and expansive congressional districts, as has been mentioned already this morning, the increasing costs of these campaigns are driven by the cost of paid television advertising. I believe, Mr. Chairman, that the lowest unit rates for purchasing political advertising time must be made available to candidates. And it should be made clear that the lowest unit rate means fixed and non-preemptible spots must be sold at the lowest preemptible rate for that same time of day and day of the week. I do not believe, however, that the lowest unit rate should apply to those non-candidate groups who make independent expenditures for political advertising to affect the results of a political campaign. These independent groups should not be afforded the same privilege as is afforded political candidates. In my view, the further discounting of airtime below the lowest unit rate or even free time for political advertising are neither necessary nor advisable. Further discounted or free time, particularly if there are no campaign spending limits, will only increase the number of manipulated and manufactured political messages and further saturate the television airwaves. I also urge this subcommittee and the Congress to pass a bill which includes some element of public financing of House and Senate campaigns. The relentless pursuit of private money has turned the public away from the political process and from politicians. Improvements in the relevance and content of campaigns combined with an element of public investment may increase public interest, trust, and involvement in the process and reverse the present sorry tide. As to content, Mr. Chairman, while I do not favor free airtime for political advertising, I applaud those TV stations and affiliates which offer free time for candidate debates and equal access live appearances. As co-chairman of the Commission on Presidential Debates, I commend Edward Fritz, the President of the National Association of Broadcasters, for NAB's support of presidential debates and the Commission's work. And you, Mr. Chairman, are to be commended for your efforts to make presidential debates a permanent and central element of our presidential campaigns. In addition, I would support those suggestions which would lengthen individual television spots. We need to get away from the ever-shrinking sound bites, and we need to get away from those ads, which are nothing but photo bites, if you will, and introduce more substance and enlightening political discourse to our campaigns. Further, with respect to the proliferation of negative campaign advertising, I support those measures which would increase candidate accountability and require clear candidate identification on televised campaign advertisements, has been commented upon by Congressman Bryant earlier this morning. The gap between the trivia of modern campaigns and the gravity of modern governance increases with each election. This gap must be closed. The relevance of campaigns to people's lives and the challenges they face in the future must be made a part of future campaigns, and one way to begin closing that gap is to reduce the cost of the campaigns and to improve their contents. I submit that the suggestions that I have put forth this morning are merely modest steps to begin along that path, Mr. Chairman, but I thank you for this opportunity to testify before this committee, and I look forward to responding whatever questions you or other members may have.
Thank you, Paul, very much. Our next witness, the Honorable William Brock, is the former chairman of the Republican National Committee. We welcome you, sir, and whenever you feel comfortable, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be relatively brief, but I want to make just a couple of points. First of all, there are people here on this panel who know a great deal more about television commercials and advertising than I do, but let me talk about the importance of television itself, the medium, because I think that's sort of the context of this conversation. When I was national chairman in the late 70s, I kept hearing word about the campaign that was ongoing in England, and I decided just to go over there and watch. And I spent a couple of days campaigning with a couple of members of Parliament out in the ridings. Spent a day with a lady named Thatcher on her bus, and then spent a couple of days just looking at the television that was being run and at the commercials that were being prepared. They were running 10-minute spots, and they were the most eloquent pieces of work I had ever seen in politics. They were tremendously educational and yet still had a great sense of humor and content, and it was fun to watch. I came back convinced that we were missing something in this country in the utilization of this medium of communication that we ought to try to pick up from what others were doing. We haven't done that. We have increasingly gone to use television as a billboard rather than as a method of communication. And that troubles me. It troubles me because we are creating a situation not just with our advertising. And this is not a comment so much on advertising as it is on television per se. Any candidate that would rather run an ad than be on the news is out of his mind. And yet the news holds you to a tighter time frame than the ads do. Now, 30 seconds is a maximum amount to be on the news for most stations, and you can't really substantively address an issue in that period of time. I don't know how under freedom of the press we can address an issue like that, or freedom of speech, but somehow people in media have got to give some thought to that problem, because we're not developing the substance of the political campaign by either device as far as I'm concerned. On the specific bill, accepting the fact that it is addressing the most important single method that we have for communicating with people in this country, and that's television, I think there is logic to some effort to change the law because the present law doesn't work. I think that's fairly obvious. First of all, state stations don't comply with it, but even if they did, you as members of Congress or your challengers couldn't live with it, because you can't in a 30-day campaign allow preemption. You can't take that chance. So I don't think it's a workable bill as the law is presently written. The bill does have one particular benefit that I think is important, and that is that it would, in my judgment, help challengers whose primary burden is coming up with the funds to campaign anyway against an incumbent. And that, to me, is almost worth the whole conversation, because my concern is not with spending, but with what I think is the outrageous accumulation of law and regulation that has occurred over the last 2 or 3 decades that makes it almost impossible to challenge a member of the House of Representatives. I think that violates the whole essence of what the Constitution was all about, that this should be the people's body. And when we run 98, 99% re-election and the popularity of the Congress is 50%, something is fundamentally wrong. And I don't understand why we are incapable of coming, well, I do understand why we're incapable of coming to grips with it, because it is difficult for incumbents to vote against incumbent interest and to vote for challenger interest. But the fact is that that, to me, is a central component of this debate. I want to just make one parenthetical comment on the previous comment by Sam Jensen and his conversation with a couple of your members here on subsidizing parties. I don't think it's important to subsidize parties. I think it's dangerous to do that. But I think it is equally dangerous to limit parties, as we have done. We have, and Paul Kirk and I have talked about this, made parties increasingly irrelevant in the United States by the limits we put on them. And I would suggest that any significant reform ought to open the opportunity for parties to participate more openly in the process. If there were anything that could remove those barriers, I would be actively willing to support that, because I think it is dangerous for people to lose parties. That is the bridge that they have between themselves and the political process. It is the method by which people can effectuate and enlarge their voice. And we are running a substantial risk in this country when we think that that these are unnecessary irrelevancies. In essence, Mr. Chairman, I support the legislation that you have proposed to reduce this cost to go to the lowest rate. I would hope that when you allow candidates to buy at the preemptible rate, which is my preferred approach, that you don't allow the time to be preempted. I think that would remove one of the problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brock. Our next two witnesses will, without question, go down in the annals of political history as two of the small handful of people who helped redefine electoral politics in our country in the last quarter of the 20th century. And we're very pleased to have them with us today. And we'll first recognize Roger Ailes. Whenever you feel comfortable, please begin.
I don't have a prepared statement that I want to read this morning. I will submit something on lowest unit rate for the record and comment on a couple of pieces of it. For benefit of discussion this morning, I would like to just point out that we've been using some terms, television, and every use of the term television this morning has sort of been pejorative, as if it somehow interfered with the political process. I think people do know a lot more about politics and the political process today because of television than they did when politicians used to wave off the back end of a train and people were selected in back rooms. So I think television has added in a very positive way, both in the advertising business and in the programming business, to people's knowledge of the political process. The fact that they're dissatisfied, in effect, with that process may not be strictly the product of the advertising. They may be, in fact, unhappy with the product, the candidates, the elected officials, and my guess is that in saying that a Congress can't get together on a budget may depress them as much as a political ad that they might see once every 4 years or once every 6 years or something. So I think people tend to be dissatisfied with the product, not necessarily with the advertising. The Ford Motor Company spends $740 million a year to advertise year-round their product, and the people who are against political ads talk about the fact that they're so much like product advertising, so I'm using that analogy. I don't necessarily totally agree with that. But $740 million, and the average American has a lot, and those are advertised year-round, and the average American has more confidence in the Ford automobile than he does a congressman. So I think that we have to look at the definition of terms. We use the word negative advertising. Negative advertising is defined by usually incumbents that anything the opponent says about him is a negative ad. If we were able to rule that only positive ads could in fact be used, that people could only say good things about themselves and nobody could ever say anything about their voting record, their previous statements, their biography, or what have you, do you think there would be any distortion in those ads? My guess is there would be, and as a matter of fact, there's considerable evidence that there's as much distortion, if there is any, in positive advertising as negative advertising. If you take a barrel of apples, you dump it into two baskets, you mark one apples, you mark the other one negative apples, and ask people to go by and pick one, they'll stay away from the negative apples, even though they're the same apples. If you say negative advertising is any mention of the opponent, then it automatically becomes bad, and in fact, I don't believe that that is the case. So I think that the terms television, negative advertising, sound bites, the sound bite in the presidential campaign went from 1984 to 1988 from 14 seconds to 9 seconds, but that was not in advertising, that was in the evening news. And the news has a lot more to do with how people vote than the advertising. Advertising has essentially become a defensive mechanism today where if your opponent does it, you have to do it, and so on. So there may be more ascribed to this power or this evil of television and advertising and money. There's a presumption in this room that whenever you say money, that's bad. There's something wrong with that. I think the context of these terms needs to be examined as well. Now, to lowest unit rate, and I won't take much time on this, obviously the stations in this country are undergoing a tremendous economic stretch at the moment. The fragmentation of the television market, the lowering in advertising has created some chaos. There's tremendous pressure on station owners and managers to create profits. They, if they're a well-run station, can still create profits. But bashing broadcasters is not going to solve the problem. And in fact, most congressmen don't want to, because they have to go back to the home district and get on the evening news. So they'd rather bring in guys like us to bash broadcasters. In fact, the broadcasters do have some real economic pressures. I think that giving away free time is something that should be considered. But the truth is, if I were running for Congress, I would, if I had a choice of allowing my opponent to have a half hour a week on television or $500,000 to run ads, I suppose I'd rather give him the half hour a week, because most people find political broadcasts boring and don't watch. So I think that that's not necessarily the way to go. I think the idea of having somebody trash the other guy in person on television, in theory, is a good idea. It's probably unconstitutional. I think there's a serious question of censorship. I think that everybody knows that that won't work, so it would eliminate the ability to discuss the other person's record. You would look mean or venal. It has a bias toward people who are good performers, as opposed to people who may just be very good at doing the job. And I think those are some of the considerations you have to think about. But I would urge the committee to look at the terms and make sure everybody's defining the terms in the same way, so that we can have a meaningful dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ailes, very much. Our next witness, Bob Squire, has become to the Democratic Party what you are to the Republican Party, very closely identified with its campaign strategies over the last quarter of a century, and very much linked almost as part of a similar story over that time frame. So we welcome you, Bob, and whenever you feel comfortable, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you, too, for inviting us this morning. We appreciate being here, and we hope that we can, in some way, provide you with some of the information from the battlefield that will help you make the law you need to improve the system. I also want to thank you for allowing us to be a part of this very distinguished panel. Mr. Kirk here, my chairman, was a man I actually worked for to help him be elected chairman, and I shouldn't say this, I suppose, on the record, but I did it for free. But it was a great investment, because that allowed me in the years to come to do even more free work for Mr. Kirk, pro bono for our party. I have complimented Senator Brock so many times in previous circumstances that I think I have probably severely hurt his reputation in the Republican Party. So I will not do that to him again this morning, but he knows how I feel about him. Mr. Ailes and I have been at each other, as you suspect, Mr. Chairman, since 1968, when he sat in one control room with Richard Nixon doing a 2-hour telethon, and I sat in another control room across town in L.A. With Hubert Humphrey, working the last night of an election, which I still refer to as a tie, but he claims as a victory.
We called the 1960 election a tie.
The thing I thought I could do here, I have not prepared a statement, but I thought what I could do is maybe just fill in some of the blanks from previous testimony, and then obviously offer ourselves for questions. It seems to me that a strategy for what you are trying to do here would include basically 3 points. One, to improve the quality and flow of information to voters in the course of an election. Secondly, to get money out of the system. I agree with much of what Mr. Ailes has said, but I think that one of the goals always should be to try to bleed money out of the political system. And thirdly, obviously, to do all of this without making serious sacrifices in the First Amendment. In 1972, I worked with a group of colleagues and actually invented this idea, lowest unit rate. I've always been sorry we weren't able to come up with a better title for it. But the idea was clear, which was to simply take the political candidate and to move him from being the least favored client of a television station, because in those days, political candidates, because they only come to a station infrequently, were really being quite badly gouged in terms of rates. We're trying to take them from being the least favored client of television stations to the most favored client. And in the first few years after we were actually to get this in practice, we found that we were able to take about 30% of the money out of the system. The idea, obviously, comes from a belief that since the people's airwaves are actually broadcast on by people who don't pay a fee for it, that in some way the American people ought to be able to take back their airwaves at the time of election to conduct the most important transaction of the democracy, namely that election. I have come to believe that a solution to this problem, and as you're working between the House and the Senate on how you begin to frame this legislation, one of the ideas that has occurred to me is that if you could provide a period of free television time of responsible length in the period leading up to an election, in other words, in the most heated period of the election, the last week or 2 weeks of the election, and mandate that that time be available from broadcasters equally to challengers and incumbents, and then offer that free time as an inducement to candidates, and basically say to candidates, all right, if you want to take this free television time that's going to be provided by these stations, you must do two things. And you can decide whether you want to do these two things, but if you want to eliminate political negative advertising in this period, then what you can do is simply say you have to be willing to not name your opponent in this advertising that is being given to you free. And you can do that, I think, because since the candidate has agreed to accept the time, which is public time, in the agreement of acceptance, they would make that agreement. The other agreement you could require from them would be that they would not do any more paid advertising. This also, it seems to me, has another great advantage, and that is that it not only eliminates a lot of money from the system, but it eliminates the worst money in the system. I don't think there is a person here who has worked in a campaign, a person as a member of the press who has covered a campaign, certainly those of us in this panel, and certainly the candidates in this room from both parties, would agree with me that the worst money in a political campaign is the last money in a campaign. The last money in a campaign is always the money that is looking for value received for what it gives to candidates. And by a process like this, you would eliminate a great chunk of late money from the system. You would also make the last money the money that came in up to the period 2 weeks preceding the election. In Senate races and races for governor, about 60% of the money, not a third of the money, goes to television time buys. So there'd be an enormous hunk of money that you could then examine. The press would have an opportunity to examine for the last 2 weeks. And I think that would clean up a lot of the problems in financing. I would also like to comment on what we call the talking head idea. And my fear with the talking head proposals is that we would end up in a situation in which we would make politics even more of a performance art than it already is. And it would become, it seems to me, a performance on television rather than a performance in public life. And as a result, I've always thought that it was not an idea that was particularly appealing in terms of improving political communication. I also fear that if we did something like that, that in the future, someday we'd end up in a situation in which some second-rate actor could actually become President of the United States. We certainly don't want that again. I was only partisan once.
That's amazing.
Well, I was trying to follow your good example. Thank you very much for allowing us to be here, and we'd be glad to answer your questions.
We'll now turn to questions from the subcommittee. And let me ask Mr. Ailes and Mr. Squire this question. Can you just take us through the process that you use in negotiating with TV stations for time, and what effect are changing the lowest unit rate definition would have in helping you to ensure that your candidates would have the optimum access to their local broadcasting outlets?
Roger and I both do our own time buying.
Yes, we do.
So we actually have this process in-house. You buy time basically from two different sources. You buy it from agents who represent many stations, and you buy it from individual stations. So we do both. The room where this takes place in my shop is one of the liveliest places in the building, because when you walk in there, what you hear is basically our time buyers on the telephone with people having terrible arguments about what it is they're being charged for the time that they're buying. And this is a very tough give and take process that goes on all the time. The reason lowest unit rate does not work now is that lowest unit rate was once the lowest rate that a station had to offer. What happens then is that that time is almost always preemptible. In other words, a station can take back that bargain it made with you for that time if it finds someone who was willing to pay the higher preemptible rate for that time. So when you get close, so early in an election, you might be willing to buy time that way and take your chances, because you could correct the losses week by week as you move through, say, a 5 or 6 week broadcast schedule. But as you get closer and closer to the election, you must be very certain that you're in a situation where you have your material on the air, because if you don't, you can get in real trouble. For instance, you might buy all non-preemptible time at lowest unit rate for the last 10 days of the election, and then find on Friday at 5 o'clock you get 2 or 3 calls from the station saying, sorry, your opponent has just paid the higher preemptible rate, and your schedule will not be on the air Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday before the election. Obviously, you can't possibly put yourself in that situation, so you buy the higher rate. Your legislation goes a long way towards basically making the second half of the reform that lowest unit rate really provided. The other thing I would say about that is that, and there is also, I think, an implication inside the dialogue about this problem, that people like us prefer the length we're dealing with. What we deal with is what we're given. And one of the other realities is that a 60-second spot costs precisely twice a 30. So when you buy a 60-second spot, it only runs half as many times as a 30. And that is a decision we're making now that Roger and I didn't have to make when we first came into this business. When we first came into this business, we made a lot of material that was much longer than what we make now. 60-second spots, 2-minute spots, 5-minute spots, half-hour films. Because as the length went up, you got a bargain on the rate, and as a consequence, a 2-minute spot didn't cost 4 times a 30. A 2-minute spot probably cost what a 60 cost, and a 60 cost maybe only 40% more than the 30 did. Those days are gone, and as a consequence, we are forced back into a 30-second spot. And if you're all worried about 30-second spots, get ready for the future, because if these kinds of reforms do not take place, you're going to be seeing 15-second spots. And the other thing I think you should understand is that as the costs go up, the breadth of the dialogue goes down. If you have only 4 or 5 commercials in a general election, as we did, for instance, in Texas this year, you have to make the entire argument you're making for your candidate and why your candidate is better than the opponent in a period of 4.5 minutes.
Mr. Rales, do you want to take a shot at this question?
I'll just name a couple things. One of the problems is that there is increasing pressure to put more ads on the air to penetrate to the public. I won't get into the definition of terms, but they have such things as target rating points that determine reach and frequency of your ads to a targeted viewer. And as little as 4 or 5, 6, 7 years ago, 300 targeted rating points a week would accomplish a reasonable penetration of reach and frequency, i.e., this viewer sees your spot 4.5 times or whatever. Today, there's, because of the clutter of advertising, the number of overall ads on the air, including commercial advertising, it takes more ads to penetrate at the same levels, so that what was 350, and I'll just give you these as reference points, it may take twice that, 700 gross rating points, to achieve the same goal today in the advertising climate that you live in. So the problem is, in fact, escalating, and the pressure for more money, in fact, is there. The stations have gotten, what we do is you go in and you ask for a schedule of spots. You ask for availabilities of commercials. If you guys put too much pressure on a station, they will simply say, all right, we'll only sell all candidates one 30-second spot a week. Well, that doesn't do you any good either. So there's a very delicate thing going on here. You have a preemptible rate and a fixed rate. Under the preemptible rate, you have preemptible with notice and without notice. That's another little trick they figured out, so that the bottom line is the salesmen are constantly pressuring you to buy those high-priced fixed rates. And now, on behalf of the stations, I will say there are many stations that are crying out for a uniform definition of lowest unit rate, because if you don't come up with it, in fact, 50 states will, and you'll be operating under a whole different set of circumstances in every state about what the lowest unit rate in fact is, which will make the process chaos. One of the things, and I'm not sure of the amount of time allowed for the lowest unit rate, but one of the ways to do it would be to balance it against an entire year. In fact, the lowest unit rate you give for a spot, usually it's the last quarter. So a lot of stations will just drive their commercial rates up in the quarter right before you go on the air. That means that your lowest unit rate was the highest rate 2 months ago. And if somebody buys a schedule of spots for a whole year, they'll say, look, we're going to charge you a little more in third quarter this year, but right after the first of the year, we'll give you some discounts and make it up. So there are 100 ways around it, and you're constantly dealing with trying to control that. But in the pressure of a political campaign, you are more often than not forced into the highest unit rate.
Thank you, Mr. Ailes. Very quickly, Mr. Kirk, Mr. Gadenson testified this morning, and Mike Sinar, who is on this subcommittee, has a proposal to the same effect as a Senate proposal, which would, in addition to lowest unit rate, also add in a 50% discount in general elections for political advertising. Now, some people suggest that that would invoke the law of unintended consequences, which would be that many races which historically have never been on television would then be driven towards it because of the extraordinary attractiveness of heading in that direction. What would be do you agree with that as a potential consequence, and what would be the effect upon public debate if, in fact, we did head in that direction, in your opinion?
First of all, I think Congressman, when he testified, made a valid distinction about the nature of congressional races versus Senate races and the nature of certain congressional districts versus others. So I don't know that the answer that I could give would be universally applicable to those situations. I do think, however, Mr. Chairman, that without a spending limit, in those races where television is the most important medium and the instrument that is the most effective for that campaign, I think one consequence clearly would be if you, in my view at least, if you added a further 50% discount, you can count on at least 50% more television advertising. And I'm not all that clear under where we are today that that is good. I think that, I mean, my own sense is that the more that we could get time for debate and exchange between candidates with some spontaneity and understanding of where they are on the issues, I think the more informed the American people would be. However, I do think that the point that was made by, I guess, everyone at the panel, including myself, that if one of the consequences would lead to longer spots per se, where a message could be explained and some substance given to it, and the voters be more enlightened than where we are now, which is Bob Squire and Roger Ailes have said, we're heading right into bumper sticker messages for TV as well as the news business. So those are a couple of observations that I would make. I think my preference would be to see the lowest unit rate as I testified, which would be non-preemptible in fact, but the lowest unit rate that a campaign would have to pay would go a long way to solve those problems.
Great. My time has expired. Recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Rinaldo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to follow up on what Mr. Kirk was just talking about. He said he favors the lowest unit rate. Well, you know, when you take campaign finance reform and you talk about broadcasting issues, you can talk about the lowest unit rate or unit charge provision, or then you can talk about requiring broadcasters to provide free time, and finally, requiring broadcasters to provide substantially discounted broadcast time. I'd like to ask the other three panelists which of the approaches they favor and why. Suppose I start with you, Mr. Brock.
I find it difficult to justify requiring broadcasters to give free time. I frankly would be sympathetic to those who say if we're going to control the channel, we want to charge them for access to the channel for any purpose, that's different. But to charge them just in effect for political time is, to me, not the way to go. I do think we have the right to say the lowest rate that you charge anybody should be available to our political process. And frankly, I'm not sure that I don't think discounting it isn't the same thing as giving it to them free. I think the same argument would obtain in both cases against that. But saying you can't, in effect, rip off politicians just because they have campaigns that only come up every couple of years, that's a fair thing to say. And I think we can do that.
Thank you. Mr. Ailes?
I think that I would echo what Senator Brock said. I think that I would like to see the broadcasters voluntarily come up with a program which would enhance the political process by providing some combination, first of all, an adherence to lowest unit rate over a 52-week period so that somebody coming in buying a package of spots doesn't get them. If you're selling the spot, the lowest unit rate may be $100, the highest unit rate may be $200, but some guy's getting it at $50 because he bought 1,000 of them back in January. You've got to figure out what that is and figure out what that lowest unit rate is, stick to it, and if the broadcasters will enforce it, that's fine. If they don't, then the FCC may have to set up a program much as the IRS where they audit stations at random, a small percent once a year. They can lose their license if they fool around with it. That's a very extreme position. I would not like to see it go to that. People say, how do you pay for that? I don't know. You could take some money out of the congressional office staff, move 2 staffers over to this task force that checks stations, since television is so important. But I think that the broadcasters really, I think many of them are, and in fact probably most of them, are public-minded. I think a dialogue with the broadcasters about coming up with a program for their community or their state or their ADI that in fact will enhance the political process, whether it's offering debates, a certain amount of free time, voluntarily given, enforcement of lowest unit rate, certain number of appearances on their news programs or talk shows, talk programs. I think they could go a long way to cleaning up this mess by themselves if they would do it, and I would like to see that as a first step.
First, for those people that are in the row behind the members of Congress, I disagree with Mr. Ailes' solution to the problem. I do not want to eliminate positions. I'm for a pay raise for you.
He's for a pay raise for everybody.
I think your question is at the very crux of campaign reform, because it seems to me with free time, and I call it the public's time, or with the use of discount, what you can do is begin to shape this political communication system into the kind of system you really want. If we decide that what we want to do is at some point in the campaign to have candidates no longer speak about each other, but to come to the point where they speak about themselves, and maybe at the end of the campaign that's a time to do it. I personally think it's a good idea for candidates to point out to voters what they think are their qualifications and what disqualifies their opponent. But maybe in the last 2 weeks of the election it's time for the candidates to come back to an argument about what they are all about and stop talking about their opponents. If you want to do that, then what you can do is you can give discounts to the candidates that are willing to do that. And you could give deep discounts to the candidates that are willing to do that by coming on television and speaking in their own behalf. I think it's a good idea.
When you give free time, though, couldn't it be argued that this is unfair to broadcasters, particularly in an era or a period of time when broadcasters are finding it very, very difficult to remain economically viable, and every day our subcommittee hears about the problems of over-the-air broadcasters. Some people even predict the demise of it if something isn't done to correct some of their economic problems.
One of the advantages of having been at this for 23 years is that I have been in rooms like this before, and I once testified so many years ago I'm not going to say, but it was before Senator Pastore. Those of you who remember how long ago that was.
You really don't look 110.
and sitting next to me was Frank Stanton of CBS, and when we were first arguing the case for lowest unit rate, Frank Stanton said that if we pass lowest unit rate in his present form, that you will bankrupt the owned and operated stations of CBS and its network. And I made a very generous offer to Mr. Stanton at the time. I said, Mr. Stanton, I've just got a little cottage industry communications company, but I'd be glad to take over your network and your stations during the period covered by the law and run them and then return them to you in good shape and then retire. And he was not amused by that idea. I don't think you have a problem in terms of the economic health of broadcasting over a long period of time. You can make the opposite argument. They have an awful lot of free time on their hands right now in which they're basically running public service announcements. Why not have those public service announcements be public service announcements that contribute to the transaction of the democracy that's most important, which is an election?
I am perhaps more sympathetic to the broadcasters because I grew up in the broadcasting industry and understand the station owner and general manager and sales manager's problems. I do think there's a very serious, it's a separate issue and one that maybe can't be handled by this committee or in this time period, but there is a very serious issue of the economic health of broadcasting stations. And I guess that's why I said the broadcasters should meet and discuss the possibility of some voluntary basket or group of services they might be able to provide to a political campaign that would not, in fact, have tremendous economic impact on their stations. Because I think just to continue to say we can take this away from broadcasters when they've dropped to about a 60% where they used to be 90% market share, those are enormous numbers, and I think that the communication systems of the United States are in some danger today because of that fragmentation.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair will recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as most of you know, our state is one of the states that's involved in a lawsuit over this very question. So, and I'm included in the class, so I think it best that I not comment too much on what I guess the main thing that we're here today for. But since we've got these experts, I'd like to ask you, Mr. Kirk. You had talked about the low participation in the presidential election and the midterm elections, and of course we've seen that trend. And I'd like to hear from you if you have any other ideas what would help to get citizen participation in the process.
Well, I think the point that was made earlier by Congressman Gidgenson of Connecticut about voter registration, whether it's universal, or I believe in 1985, the Commission on National Elections, which was made up of bipartisan representation of probably 60 or more individuals, one of their recommendations was to suggest that the election day be proclaimed a holiday. I think when you get to the point that you've got only 36% in midterm elections and 50% of a quadrennial election in a democracy such as ours, and the trends, as you say, heading down, that's worth trying. It is, you know, we're talking about the right of citizenship to vote and participate in the process that they, and you know, there are constraints and registration laws that vary from one state to the other, but if there was, if it could be structured properly and schools and others paid attention to the importance of civic responsibility and heightened the importance of this exercise, a national holiday, that combined with some registration, lowering of some registration obstacles might be another way to enhance and improve the percentage of participation in the democracy. I do think, as I mentioned in my comments, that the amount of money in the process and the content of some of the messages are doing more to drive people away from the process than to encourage them to participate in it.
May I comment on that?
Yes, sir.
I'm just astonished by this conversation. I'm really astonished. The thought that low participation has anything to do with registration or election days or holidays is just boggles the mind. I mean, people don't vote for a number of different reasons. Some of them don't vote truly because they're disillusioned, they're giving up. Others don't vote because they are totally contented. They don't have any reason to express any demand for change. A lot of them just don't think it makes a gall darn bit of difference. And in fact, it doesn't. Why should it? 98, 99% of the Congress gets elected every cotton-picking time they run, whether there's a reason to vote for them or not. And we don't solve our country's problems. Everybody is sitting here saying the deficit's a horrendous, horrible problem, but the Congress can't agree on what to do about it. We know that we got a problem with spending, and every time you pick up the paper, we're adding to the pork. And all I hear in terms of reform of the process is, well, let's take a holiday on Election Day. Like, we got to make it easier to vote, and that'll change something. Spending limits are the real problem with the system. But that's just baloney. We spend less money on politics in the United States than we spend on fireworks. What the hell are we talking about? People don't have a reason to vote in their mind because they don't think it makes any difference. And until they get the sense that their voice matters, they're not going to have that great incentive to participate. They didn't have to live what the people did in Hungary and Czechoslovakia for the last 40 years. They haven't had to suffer what the people in Nicaragua have had to suffer. All of a sudden, people say, well, we'll make it easier for you. I've heard this talk all of my political life. Give them postcard registration, make it easier to register. Well, we gave them everything in the world. And we got registration down, not up. Participation down, not up. Has nothing to do with registration or a holiday. It has to do with whether or not they feel like their voice matters. And frankly, when you take away the parties, I think Paul and I would agree on this, that's their access point. And if they can't get involved in a political party because we've denuded the party of any authority or ability to act because we've got more constraints on the party than anybody else, where do they then go?
Mr. Chairman, if I might just say that I was asked to talk about additional issues. I think the percentage of participation is it's more than regrettable. I mean, it's embarrassing. And my sense is that all these things in some way are intertwined. And the more that the nation itself and the people who represent it, just as you folks, feel that this is a deplorable situation heading in the wrong direction and start sending some signals that go right back to civics classes in schools and the responsibilities of citizens. And I agree, the right of a free citizen is to not to vote as well. But they're related to education, they're related to what our country thinks of that right, they're related to the money in the system and the limits, they're related to the content of the campaign, they're related to whether campaigns are competitive and whether people think they really do have an impact on it, and that relates to how we solve our public problems, and whether people, when they go back to the polls, have to be held accountable. So I can't separate them out easily in my mind. I think they're all part of a package, and I think, as was said earlier by myself and others, they're not all going to be solved by this subcommittee, but I do think they all relate to what we're here to try to enhance.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Without addressing, and you've already addressed, I think, the issue of free time, but I'd like to ask Mr. Brock and Mr. Ailes to address the other portion of the recommendation regarding free time made by Mr. Kirk and endorsed by Mr. Squire, which has to do with the candidate, incumbent/candidate, talking only about themselves, as I understand it. Don't even mention your opponent. And that's really what you intended, Mr. Kirk, right? You only talk about yourself, who you are and what your background is and how you've participated in the past as an incumbent, or how you've participated in a community in the past if you're a challenger. What are the good points, in other words, of you about yourself? That's
Right,
what
and
you
also
intended.
including the opportunity for debate or equal access live participation by both candidates.
A debate on the issues?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Well, then you're mentioning your opponent in a sense there when you talk about
I
a
would like
debate.
to see, as the broadcasters have done in many instances, to continue to offer free time, voluntary free time, to both candidates to participate in exchanges on the
Yes.
issues. I don't
This
think
this has been done, of course.
it has been.
Well, I guess I interpreted what you meant, and of course it intrigues me, and that is not that the debate aspect, that's old. I mean, that's old hat, and I'm not really sure, in my opinion. I've never really thought that debate, spontaneity, and that sort of thing is significant, as some people seem to make it be. I think we've got to know more of who the candidates are, frankly, rather than how quick they are on the draw spontaneously in a debate, or how they part their hair or something of that nature. Mr. Squire mentioned something about the second-rate actor. Well, as far as I'm concerned, that's all acting. I think it's more important the substance of a person, who the individual might be, who has he been, who he or she has been in the past, how they performed in the community, if they're a challenger, and how they performed in their job as an incumbent. So, I'm intrigued with possibly affording time, I hate to say, and agree with free time, discounted, or some sort of a formula there that would make available to the electorate out there the background of these people. Who are they? Who have they been? And that sort of thing. Because I've always felt, quite frankly, political campaigns, I'm not sure how much the electorate should even believe in the rhetoric, that takes place. Facts is really, I think, more significant. And so I guess I'll ask, we'll go to Mr. Brock and Mr. Ailes first. How would you feel about some sort of, not free time, because you've already indicated you'll be against free time, although again, when you talk about these debates, that is free time, but some sort of a discounted or some sort of a formulated type of a thing that would make available to the electorate, maybe for the first time, who these people really are?
Well, if I may just jump first, and I am I'm sort of fascinated by the whole tone of the conversation. I hear my two friends in the other party talking about no longer speaking about the other candidate, or not even naming your opponent in the last couple of weeks. I think probably people will learn more about my opponent from me than they will from him. I'm sure not going to tell anybody all of my warts. And I'm not going to talk about the votes that maybe I didn't think were popular in my district. I'm going to talk about the votes that were popular. How in the world are people going to know? I mean, we have two ways to learn about things if we limit ourselves to candidates. I can talk about myself, or my opponent can talk about me. Or maybe we could come up with a way to have a third-party independent panel evaluate. They're called voters. That's what the whole process is all about. And anything that limits their access to information limits their ability to make a rational choice and limits their incentive to be involved. So we're back to the basic issue. let me pick up on something that Roger said that I happen to particularly agree with, and that is the voluntary utilization of time by stations for the purpose of having and enhancing a debate. Now, if I thought every member of Congress would agree to a debate, I think that'd be wonderful. The problem is that incumbents don't ever want to debate.
Yeah, as they are advised by gentlemen such as you.
We've never.
No, I don't advise candidates, but
we've never put anything.
When I say you, I don't mean you specifically, but in general.
Well, but keep in mind one thing about political consultants. I can't speak for Mr. Squire, although I often do.
And very well.
I have never put a commercial on the air, nor forced a candidate to do anything that he didn't sign off on.
I bet that's true with most consultants. But that.
Well, I like to think that every candidate has enough control to be a party to any decision.
Well, but there are a lot of candidates who go around saying that political consultant is so-and-so and so-and-so. That is malarkey. Our job is to operate in the candidate's best interest and give him the advice that will get him the most votes. He ultimately makes the decision about what he's going to do.
This is not to say that Roger wouldn't like a system where he could make those decisions.
My time is up.
I would like to make one comment on what he says about the voluntary, and that is that it seems to me that since 99% get reelected, if the real goal here is to broaden it out a little bit and give challengers a chance so that voters have an opportunity at a real choice, 80% of the PAC money goes to incumbents or something like that. I said I was not opposed to free time. I'd be in favor of some kind of voluntary free time, and I think broadcasters would give that time, but I think it is ludicrous to think that you should not be able to talk about your opponent, and I think it's ludicrous to think that the American public cannot distinguish what is fair and the press won't point out what is accurate. If you put something on the air that is inaccurate, it will blow up in 2 hours and you'll be back on defense. And if you put something on the air that is unfair, the American public will take it out on you. And if Congress had more confidence in the American public, maybe the American public would have more confidence in Congress.
Gentleman's time has expired, and for the record, that was malarkey, not markey. Although there have been people who have accused me of having the word mean the same thing. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Bryans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with most of what Senator Brock said a moment ago, but I would like to point out something that I think has not been looked at carefully enough, and that is simply this. As long as the emphasis in American politics is on personality rather than on governing principles, incumbents are going to have an advantage, and you will not be able to erase that advantage, no matter what you do with the frank, with campaign money, or anything else.
I agree with that.
It's just like anyone in this audience who has a job. If I go to their workplace and say, look, that guy's had this job for 10 years, I can do a better job, I'd like to have the job. As long as that guy's there and can please the boss every day and write a memo and do all that's asked of him, he's going to have the advantage over me in taking away his job. That is exactly what we do every day here in this business. We were all raised with, well, you made the remark earlier, Mr. Kirk, that the observation about the very low voter turnout in America compared to other countries. I suspect, and I haven't looked at this carefully, but I suspect that most of those other countries have parliaments where parties and the governing principles enunciated by those parties are what people vote for or against, by and large, rather than personalities. There's some personality emphasis at the top with the candidate for prime minister, but most of the way you're talking about whether it's going to be Labor or Conservative or whatever the parties are in any given country. We were all raised here to believe that the difference in a democracy and what came before democracies is that we're a government of laws and not a government of men and women, which implies principles rather than personalities. Yet all of the elections today are run on the basis of marketing personalities, which is what these gentlemen now are required to do. That's their line of work. My district in Dallas voted 60% for Ronald Reagan and 60% for me. And for the next 2 years, people streamed through my office trying to get me to do things to stop what Ronald Reagan was proposing. I mean, how do you explain that except that they're focusing mostly on the personalities rather than the governing principles during these elections? It occurs to me that we ought to do exactly what Mr. Kirk and Mr. Brock have talked about and find a way to reinvigorate these parties and reduce the extent to which a candidate for Congress or the Senate can be a totally free agent, totally free of what his party stands for, and run as my next door neighbor in Congress does, who's a member of this committee as well and a good friend of mine, on a platform very different from what generally is viewed to be the platform of the Democratic Party, when right across the county line I'm over there being a hardline national Democrat. Yet we both get elected by similar margins. That ought not to be happening in America today, and I think we ought to. I'm curious to know what you think about the idea of perhaps having the parties raise the money and the parties also distribute the money to the candidates so that there gradually becomes a cohesiveness in the two messages offered, and the public has the ability to choose between two understandable and different sets of governing principles. And it will be clear after one party wins or the other party wins who is in charge of the government and who gets the credit and who gets the blame, very much as it is in Great Britain today and in some of these other parliamentary democracies. Mr. Kirk and then Mr. Brock.
Well, I think, first of all, Congressman, the distinction you make about our democracy and others of parliamentary nature is accurate and is a valid distinction. Secondly, I would say that strengthening the parties in this country goes right to the root of what we should be doing. I don't know, however, that given the power and impact of television, you're ever going to completely change what is now out of the bottle. This is a personality cult society these days. It's been driven in large part by television. I don't know that that will change. I do think that the strengthening of parties is an enormously important obligation, really. I know when, after the '84 election, when I became chairman, one of the things was that there were Democrats in the Congress and elsewhere who were running either away from or against the National Party in order to win back home. I mean, it was upside-down politics. So we did take some steps to get a platform that was unifying and that would not alienate people who carried the Democratic standard when they ran for election. We need more resources to try and do that, to bring more cohesion into the party. And I do think that the money, one of the suggestions just off the top, I think the system might be helped if PACs, which are directly related now to the individual candidate and give him or her the tag of special interest, if PAC money could be directed more to the parties by some mechanism. The party is a mediating buffer, if you will. And the bigger and broader it is, the less the tags that you're going to get about special interests, and the candidate can speak his or her own voice. But I think any steps that can be taken, and I'm sure Bill has other thoughts and ideas to strengthen the parties, would go a long way to strengthen our system.
Well, let me just fundamentally agree, because Paul and I very much share the belief that parties are the intermediating institution. They are the instrument of empowerment for the average citizen who has no other access to the process. 500,000 people in a congressional district. A member of a party has more access than the person who doesn't belong to a party. It's just straightforward and simple and mathematically logical. So whatever we can do to empower people by empowering the parties and in strengthening the parties is in the national interest, in my judgment. It is really tough to do under the current laws. But you could begin by something that Paul and I have both suggested here and in other occasions, and that is to require PAC contributions to channel through the parties. Not for the primary, obviously, but for the general election. Once the party has a nominee, then you remove all of this smell that is attached, whether fairly or not. It's there, and it is part of the disillusionment that occurs in the United States. You can also raise the personal deduction and remove the limit on parties. As long as there's disclosure, why do we worry about those sorts of things? But one point I really do want to just take 30 seconds additional on, and that was your point about sort of codifying these party positions in such a clear way that people really have a fundamental choice. I'd like to move to greater clarity. I think the Democrats will have greater problems with that than we will, but that's probably this year. Next year it'd probably be us. Nothing wrong with the objective. However, we do have in this country this concept of parties being broad enough with their umbrellas to be really and truly inclusive of a broad range. It's part of the way we debate internally in the party before we go to the full public debate. And I want to be sure that we don't get to the point where we're saying, okay, we're going to limit access to parties in order to have a straightforward platform. I don't think either party would be served well by, I think the country would be disastrously served by that.
I'm disappointed that you focused on the extreme problem that could ensue from my general comments rather than on what we might be able to accomplish, particularly if we avoid going to that extreme. Because I'm trying to get at what you're trying to get at. You cannot reduce the importance of personality marketing unless you supplant it with an appeal to the public to vote for a set of governing principles, a general set of governing principles.
I'm not arguing that at all, and I should have said that I agree with that. And I want to remind you, in 1979, I was the first chairman of a party that went to the nation with party advertising saying, if you vote for Republican, this is what you get. I also mentioned what you might get if you voted for the Democrats.
Sure you did.
And, but I really do think that the parties ought to stand for something, and they ought to state it as clearly as they can. But I wanted to raise that caution flag because an exclusionary party is the worst thing that can happen in this country.
Mr. Squire wants to put in a word for the Democrats.
It seems to me the point of your question was this business about personality. And I've spent 20-plus years listening to voters through polls, which we do constantly in every state in the Union and in now, 9 countries around the world. And, of course, then we listen to them very clearly when they come to the polls and give us the only poll that really counts. And it seems to me that they are not so much seeking personality as they are seeking character. And that is especially true in races for governor and for chief executive. In other words, they are looking for people of strong character. They're looking for people they can trust. They're looking for people who will make decisions that they think they will be comfortable with. Sometimes they're even looking for people who will make decisions they disagree with in terms of the policy, but who will make those decisions in a way that is based on the information at hand, information they couldn't actually assemble and look at themselves.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Can I just respond briefly?
Briefly.
I just want to make the point that the result of that, while it sounds very good, is that an educated voter then must keep up with the character of everybody from the president all the way down to the justice of the peace, as opposed to being able to assume that there is some consistent governing philosophy that is shared by all the people who are running on the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And I think it's an enormous turnoff and weaves into what Senator Rock was saying a minute ago about the reason people don't vote. How do you figure this out? Who's who? How do you know what's going on? Everybody's out raising money, promoting themselves. The question is, are you going to raise taxes? Are you for or against abortion? Are you going to cut Social Security? Are you going to protect the environment? Stuff like that. Those are the questions.
You improve political
Gentleman's
communication at the time
has
of elections, and that's what this committee is trying to do.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Mr. Ailes and Mr. Squire, my question is, today we're having a hearing on oversight on political advertising campaign finance reform. Now, let's assume that we were sitting here and the task at hand, and there was enormous national interest, was just negative advertising. In other words, what do we do about negative advertising? The assumption being that the public is turned off and the whole Congress was reformers. What kind of restrictions, curbs would you think be valid, should be part of a debate? Now, both of you are experts at positive, negative advertising, and I say this in a positive way. I'm not criticizing negative advertising. I use it myself. But let's assume here we were talking about possible use of identifying a candidate, other disclaimers. There are independent groups that come out with sometimes outlandish claims and nobody knows who paid for the ad. is there anything in the body politic that you would do to just narrowly deal with negative advertising?
No, I think, and I don't want what I said earlier to be misconstrued. I believe that negative advertising is very useful. I don't believe it turns off voters. I think I can show you evidence in both focus groups and opinion attitude research to show you that voters are very interested in the comparisons that go on between candidates. If those comparisons are not true, learn about it in the newspaper the next day that it's not true, or if they seem unfair, they're going to be turned off by them. But if they're fair and true, they're going to use them. So I'd let them alone and let the voters be aware of what they see.
Well, you know as well as I do, sometimes there are negative ads. Sure, there's the voting record negative ad that can easily be checked, but other times, you know, we are talking about probing into people's sensitivities, sensibilities, soft on crime. You know how TV can manipulate, and you two guys are probably the best at bringing that out. And
But see, that's fascinating. If you said in a political ad that somebody was soft on crime and didn't put in the ad why you were making that charge, and some vote they had made or some newspaper story that had made that claim and backed it up, the voters would not believe that charge. That kind of advertising was done in the 70s when people were not focusing on political advertising. The political ads that you see now that are effective are ads that are documented. Usually Roger and I will produce a document like this to support one 30-second spot, because we want to make certain that we have put in the spot things that can be documented and proven, and also we don't want to get a backwash from a television station or a radio station or a newspaper saying that what we said is not true.
let me ask Mr. Ailes, what?
I think that again, back to my definitions of terms, the problem with it is that negative ads are presumed to be in some way unethical. I think there is such a thing as an unethical ad, but I don't think that's a negative ad. In fact, it's a very complicated issue. There are many types of so-called negative advertising. The direct attack, where you just simply say, this person did this, and you support it with facts. If that's in fact true, and the public perceives it to be pertaining to a relevant issue that they care about, and it's fair in its structure, then that will not be particularly seen as a negative ad. There's a direct comparison ad. Candidate A does this, candidate A does that. There's an indirect comparative ad, such as the Johnson ad against Goldwater in '64, in which they took a presumed premise about another candidate and did an ad around that premise which reinforced that person's personality trait. So this is an extremely complicated issue, and it's always dealt with as if somehow somebody could say, don't do negative ads, i.e. unethical ads, i.e. we stop all that, we just put candidates on camera talking about themselves and saying what wonderful guys they are, and then we'd have a re-election rate of 100%. The fact is that comparative advertising probably allows a few challengers to get through every year, and then in fact that probably helps the process.
I don't think I'm going to get very far with you two on this one, but I appreciate
Our bottom line is that I think both of us feel that if you put somebody between the voters and political communication, you're making a dangerous precedent.
And I'm not sure I'm advocating it. I just wanted to probe your thinking. To the two chairmen, and this is my last question, we're talking here about mainly political financing when it comes to congressional, senatorial, presidential campaigns. Are there any reforms needed in the way we fund our parties? Some have criticized the soft money that goes into indirect contributions to candidates that the parties administer. And we are talking about two differences in the party. Mainly, the Republicans, you financially do a lot better than Democrats do as parties, funding for your parties. In New Mexico, I end up subsidizing the Democratic Party. They don't give me any help, financial help. And recently, I've had an incident with my own party where I thought because of an undue influence, positive influence, on one of my party positions, I was left out in the lurch. And I'm sure that's the same thing with the Republican Party. There's some special interest groups that have a very strong pull on the Republican Party. And I'm wondering, just with the two chairmen, is there anything that we should be doing here about how we we fund parties. John Bryant raised the issue that we perhaps give them a more direct role. Do you have any thoughts, Paul?
Well, Congressman, I think Secretary Brock, former Chairman Brock, and I both mentioned about the possibility of PAC money being more advantageous to the process if it was contributed to the parties and have a less of a taint on the individual candidate in terms of is this guy's vote for sale, however unfair that perception may be. Secondly, I think that any kind of limits on fundraising by parties, I'd like to see if there's going to be any ceiling, that it be raised. I think disclosure by parties is a way to let people decide whether this party is, quote, in the tank of one particular interest or another. The other area that kind of goes back to Congressman Bryant's question, and I perhaps haven't thought it through as clearly as I might, but we're at a juncture, I think, where we're talking about some suggestions for public financing of Senate and House candidates. And I guess I'd have to give further thought whether that would do anything but perhaps weaken the parties. If we're right that this is a personality-driven, at present by television, process, and the public funding is given to those individuals, and there's no change in terms of the party structure, but perhaps weaken the parties. If we're right that this is a personality-driven, at present by television, process, and the public funding is given to those individuals, and there's no change in terms of the party structure, I don't think we're going to do much, if that's all it's done, to enhance and build up the party's role in the process as it moves ahead. So, I mean, I'd admittedly have to give that more thought, but that's my off-the-top reaction.
I think we are pretty much in agreement, Bill. Cutting out PAC contributions to individuals and driving them through, at least for the general election, through the parties would make an enormous difference. The thought of removing the limit is so obvious. I don't understand why we have a limit on parties. Parties are not controlling. And removing that ceiling would make an enormous difference, and increasing the deductibilities.
Gentleman from New Mexico's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Well, I thank the chairman. I listened to this with quite a bit of interest as a practitioner. I have to say that I don't have a real problem with the way the system works today. I think it would be interesting if we'd have held this same kind of hearing in Andrew Jackson's time. I'm told that his biggest campaign expense was for whiskey and hard cider, so he might have wanted to see if he couldn't get the lowest commodity rate and bulk quantity for whiskey. And when we talk about negative campaign advertising,
You have a happier constituency.
they'd be happier, that's true. I think Grover Cleveland won the White House, and he was not married, and he lost the White House when he was up for re-election, and the Republican Party ran a slogan, you know, how do you know who's going to vote for Grover Cleveland? They're going to, and you know, why would you vote for Grover Cleveland? Because he's my daddy. Because he had supposedly a large number of illegitimate children. So I don't think you can get much more negative than that. And that was in the 1880s. So, you know, I don't have a problem with the way the system's working now. If it's working as the law says it should. Now, if it's not, then we need to crack down on those violators. Certainly at the presidential level, it's very difficult for the candidates, to touch all the American voters, and so television does tend to dominate. But at the congressional level, we still get out and talk to people. In fact, I seldom do television advertising. I do a lot of radio advertising, direct mail, but I do a lot of person-to-person advertising, so to speak. And in 1986, when I was up for re-election and had a real tough campaign that year, I did a poll, and we asked people how many people had met me. And 100,000, if you extrapolate the poll results, 100,000 people in the 6th District of Texas said that they had met Joe Barton. Now, they may have hated me, but they'd at least met me. So, you know, I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that the essence of campaigning, as Congressman Bryant talked about, is the personality of the candidate. And to the extent that we let television substitute for a true campaign, we're going to be worse off. We've got to put ourselves in front of the people. If I have a question, and my questions were basically along the lines of Congressman Richardson, how do you guarantee truth in what you put on the air? In the Texas Democratic gubernatorial primary last year, one of the Democratic candidates ran an ad against the other Democratic candidate for governor, and the question was, how do you know when so-and-so's lying? The answer was, when his lips are moving. Well, now, there's no way that could be totally true. I mean, no candidate lies all the time. You know, even a Democratic candidate for governor in Texas, that just, you know, they're going to tell the truth some of the time. So how would we police that? You know, that's what I'd be more interested in, is how you police an ad like that that's obviously wrong.
Since we did that
Is that your ad?
Yeah, no, it's not. I wanted to make sure that I got that clear. I think the system, the point I was making earlier, let the people decide. The system worked very well there. The person that ran that ad lost, and that's the way the system works absolutely at its very best. The other point I'd like to make is that
But why should you let an ad on that's obviously untrue?
That's not, I mean, that is a case where 100% of the people would say, that statement's untrue, it's meant facetiously or sarcastically. What does that tell me about the person who said it, as well as the person it's said about? I mean, that's such an obvious
and that's why it should be allowed
thing
to
that
run.
it meant as a joke, and so few people won't get that, but the majority of the people will, and I think that's so far out that the real problem is, I mean, I suppose the newspaper could do a front page story the next day saying, no, he does not lie 100% of the time, 99%, whatever he decides to do. But the press does jump in on factual errors, as they correctly should. And also, frankly, if somebody says something negative about my candidate that I think is unfair or untrue, within 24 hours, we'll be back on the air straightening it out.
So you don't see...
So that option is there.
There's no... I mean, this hearing is really on charges for political advertising, but in terms of the veracity of the truthfulness of the advertising, no one sees a need to do anything about that.
If the public perceives that guy to be a liar, they'll laugh and say, you know what, that's pretty funny. That guy does lie a lot. And if they perceive him not to be a liar, they'll say that's an unfair charge, and the guy who said it should lose the election.
Well, let me ask
there are numerous cases where the numbers
I want
go
to
up or
ask
down
one
based on
question on the point of the hearing. To what extent do you two gentlemen that actually go out and buy time, do you feel that the commercial broadcast networks and individual stations violate the existing law about lowest unit rate? Is that a major problem that we really need to change the law on?
Yes.
I believe that it's, they try to violate it a lot. Sometimes they don't get away with it, but there are some good broadcasters who stick strictly to the law, but anytime you have no penalties and little chance of being caught, the temptation is there.
The way the process works, it is so hard to check. I mean, you really have to be experienced in their rate book over a period of time in order to be able to check. They basically have the evidence in hand, and they're also trying to sell you, and you really can't look at it. So
And
you
in
really
fact,
need
they
some lot of-
define lowest unit rate differently by station in some cases. They're individual lawyers, and they don't necessarily give you access to how they define it.
Well, I guess our broadcasters in Texas are just so upright and honest that we've never had that problem.
Well, I've worked in Texas, and that's true.
Well, I worked in Texas for Governor Richards, and that's certainly true.
The gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Scheuer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry I've been late, and I'll be short and sweet and to the point. Mr. Ailes, in your opinion, are the labeling and disclosure requirements sort of a key to getting this whole business of negative political campaigning under control?
I'm sorry.
The labeling and the disclosure requirements.
Labeling it as negative and...
Well, no, you said the key to solving the labeling in terms of who sponsored the ad?
Yes.
And forcing a picture to appear on...
That's correct.
Yeah, no, I testified earlier that I thought that, well, I think you should know who does the ad. I think some sort of notification as to who's making the ad is necessary. I think in some cases, it's not prominent enough, probably. But I don't think you have to put the person on camera to attack the other person, as has been one recommendation. I also think that what you need is a clear understanding of what constitutes negative advertising versus unethical advertising, and determine unethical advertising, yes. and a certain education process needs to go on. If you ask the American people, do you want to eliminate all mention of the opponent in political campaigns, the turnout would go down because they need some information about these people, otherwise they can't vote. And so I don't think that there's that big a problem, to be quite honest with you.
Will the gentleman yield briefly, please? Will the gentleman yield briefly, please? Thank you. Gentleman from New York will be the last questioner of this panel. What I'd like to do, though, is to ask each one of you, after Mr. Scheuer completes his questioning, to give us 1-minute summary of what it is that you want us to remember as we begin our process of moving forward on the lowest unit rate legislation and any other additions that you think might make some sense from your perspective in the broadcasting area. And I'll begin with Mr. Kirk and then go back down the line again. And I thank the gentleman for yielding, and you can recommence your questioning.
I'll be very brief. How do we develop some kind of sense of self-restraint and ethics on the part of candidates to keep their political ad drafters under some kind of control? After all, the buck stops there. The candidate is on the line, and he or she should be responsible for the content, the ethical content, the moral content of what goes out. How do we raise their sensibilities and get them to rein in all the people who are drafting some of these unbelievably nasty?
It's very interesting, Congressman. You're making a point that Roger was making earlier, which is that we are staff, basically, for the candidates we work for. I think that what happens is that the marketplace takes care of those people that go out of bounds. The voters really are a whole bunch of referees of this system, and when they see things that they don't like, that, Congressman Bryant, gives them information about the character of the people they're looking at. I mean, one of the ways they find out about people that they're trying to determine are good or bad, are people that they want in public office, is to examine the character of their campaigns and to decide from those campaigns what kind of people they are. Well, one of the things that Roger and I do, we spend hours and hours watching people watching our advertising in focus groups. And what's so fascinating about that is how quick they are to understand that this electronic debate is going on. There's a lot of worry, I think, on the part of some people who would reform the system that voters don't know where these advertisements are coming from. They know exactly where they're coming from. If you're attacking your opponent, they know it's your ad. And they're interested in what you're saying about it.
We hear on the one hand that voters are offended by negative advertising. But on the other hand, we hear that negative advertising really works. It has a real bite. It affects the way people vote. How do you balance off those two things?
You're hearing that negative advertising offends voters by the press, who's doing mostly negative coverage. The press in this country is interested in mistakes, attacks, and that's about it. That gets the headlines. If you do a white paper on the environment and the other guy falls off the stage, who do you think is going to be on the front page of the paper or on the evening news? So this idea that negative advertising is turning people off, there may be some things that are negative turning people off, but watch the evening news some night and try to weed out the good news. There very rarely is any, as you know. So I don't buy that for a second. Now, you ask how you can get people on these drafters, as if there's these mysterious guys out there in rooms writing negative commercials that are destroying America. There's a very simple way: fire them.
And of course, that's up to the candidate.
That's up to the candidate. If he doesn't want them doing it, fire him.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Bryant has asked for a brief 30-second interjection at this point.
I just want to observe that both Mr. Barton and my friend Mr. Schroyer brought up at the last end of the hearing here the issue of how do you deal with these negative campaigns and the quality of these negative campaign ads. And I would go back to what I said in the very beginning. I think the regulator would be, what is a candidate willing to go on television and say himself? That's the regulator. That would be the regulatory mechanism. I don't think a candidate will go on television and say himself what he will pay you all to say for him. I don't think Lyndon Johnson would have gone on television in 1964 and said, Barry Goldwater is going to drop the atomic bomb. He wouldn't have said that, but he paid somebody to say it for him. And I don't think that we ought to have a system in which I can hire you to beat up my opponent. I should have to do it if it's worth saying, and I should be willing to stand by it.
Wait till you get in a tough race. You'll be back.
Oh, I want to emphasize to you, I'm ready to do it in the next election, as long as that's what the rules are. But by golly, we ought to change these rules. That's what
May
I'm
I
saying.
speak to that? Because this is fascinating.
Very briefly, please.
The only voice in that commercial that is recognizable is the voice of Lyndon Johnson. His voice takes up about 2/3 of that spot. The name of Barry Goldwater is never mentioned in that advertising. So it was a commercial that used the voice of the candidate, Lyndon Johnson, and Goldwater was not mentioned by the announcer or by the candidate. What Roger said was true. What was going on was that people had in their minds the feeling that there was something a little bit shaky about Barry Goldwater in terms of was he going to mash down on the button. And that commercial came on and talked about the future of this little girl who was picking petals off of a daisy.
But you make my point exactly. It's exactly what happened. He got away with not having to say Barry Goldwater's going to drop the bomb. And that shouldn't happen, because that's what he was saying.
You have the option as a candidate, of course, to go on and say, my opponent is running this dirty ad about me. I'd like him to get on TV himself and say these things if he believes them.
Gentleman's time has expired. As we've seen this morning, the oft-times misused oxymoron of congressional expert, which does not apply to us in most areas, in fact all areas, except for one, that is running elections. There we have experts, because this is what we do for a business, and we each have our opinions as well that we're going to have to harmonize on this one subject where each of us feels as though we have had extensive experience with broadcasters, consultants, and our constituents in trying to forge some kind of a philosophy on this subject. You gentlemen have been very helpful to us this morning. We're going to have to move forward with your advice, which I would hope that you would be able to summarize for us in that 1 minute that would help us to get a sense of what you think should be the touchstones as we're moving forward on the rest of this legislative process. Can we begin with you, Mr. Kirk?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My views about lowest unit rate are only further reinforced after listening to Bob Squire and Roger Ailes, and that is to say that the lowest unit rate must be clear and defined at a preemptible price, but non-preemptible in practice for candidates. I think anything that could be done to lengthen the time of paid political advertisements per se helps to increase the substance and perhaps the positive effects of those. I think, if I might say parenthetically, while I was happy with the '64 landslide, that ad was both slick and distorting, and there wasn't the kind of accountability that there ought to be. And I do think when they are in that framework, there ought to be some accountability by the candidate on camera with respect to that. I think the final thing, as I said, Mr. Chairman, I think for the most part, there is, in the minds of the people, there's too much money in the process. It's distracting for the public figure. It's demeaning to what they have to do to serve the public. And I think we have to take steps to strengthen the party on the one hand and perhaps introduce an element of public funding on the other.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Brock.
I think strengthening the party and having public funding is a phrase constituting an oxymoron. And I would be very cautious. I guess the overriding comment I would make is based on 30 years of experience in the political process and trying to support a lot of reforms that we thought were valuable at the time. Almost every one came back to bite us on the ankle at one time or another. beware, Mr. Chairman, as you said earlier, of the law of unintended consequences. We have to watch out and think about there are actions that will flow out of whatever we do. On the specific instance of this law, I think it needs modification because it isn't working as it was intended. And the way you make it work is to allow the political candidate to buy time at the lowest rate that they give to anybody, which means a preemptible rate. But because he can only be campaigning in that 30 or 60 days of a final campaign, you must not allow the time to be preempted. If you do that, you have moved the process forward in this specific area, and that may be all we can agree on in this year.
Mr. Ailes.
First, I'd like to thank you for inviting us. We are, in our own way, trying to make a contribution to fix the system, and it does need some fixing. I think the lowest unit rate problem is a problem, but broadcasters are basically good people. I think you need to talk with them and ask them for their ideas. In the world of computers, it's hard for me to believe that there isn't some sort of a program that can be put in to show over a longer period of time the lowest unit rate, a 52-week period or whatever that is, and your political spots show against that, and a very simple way of determining whether or not you've got the lowest unit rate, and make that material available to candidates or their representatives or to the FCC or whoever you so choose. I think with regard to limiting or in some way getting involved in free speech, and political advertising has been stated as free speech, even that's created by producers. I think if you're going to get into the business of censorship, Congress should look into child pornography and some other things, and somewhere way down the list is political spots, and incumbents should stop whining. They're still winning 99%, and until it gets down to a real dangerous level of a 92% incumbent getting back in, I don't think they should worry about it. Challengers have got to make the case against the incumbent, or they do not have a chance.
Thank you, Mr. Ailes. Mr. Squire.
As we speak, lowest unit rate is dead. You have the power to breathe life back into that idea, and I think once you do that, that reform will make it impossible for broadcasters to change the law. Number two, I would say that the idea of public financing of campaigns, which hasn't been talked about here much today, but I would like to just leave you with one thought about, which is that if you are planning to do public financing of campaigns through the checkoff system, you ought to look at the checkoff system in presidential elections, which is nearing bankruptcy, and imagine how many people are going to check off to pay for the campaigns of the Congress. If you think we have a taxpayers' revolt going on in the United States now, wait till you start paying for your campaigns out of taxpayer money, not checkoff money. Finally, I would say, for credibility, I disagree with my chairman. Finally, I'm glad I had one opportunity in 2 hours. I think that Tony Schwartz's ad, Tony always watches C-SPAN, I think Tony Schwartz's ad was brilliant, to the point in that election, and in an ad that pushed forward the dialogue on foreign policy in that election.
I thank each of you, and I'll note in conclusion on this panel that last night I saw the new movie Robin Hood, and I saw Robin Hood reluctantly be forced to go negative on the Sheriff of Nottingham in a campaign to rid England of evil forces, and he triumphed. And I understand that this is a very complex area, and a lot depends upon your own perspective on these issues. But I will note that this subcommittee is going to move forward very aggressively on the area of lowest unit rate, preemption, that whole range of issues. We remain open to suggestions with regard to other broadcast-related reforms. We think that this is the time and this is the place, and we intend on helping constructively to make the 1990s a little bit a better place to campaign than the 1980s were. And we thank each of you for your participation. Thank you. We'll now move on to our second panel, which is equally distinguished with our first. That consists of Mr. Fred Wertheimer, who is the president of Common Cause, Mr. Norman Ornstein, who is a resident scholar for the American Enterprise Institute, and Mr. Jerry Fritz, vice president from All Britain Communications Company.
Karen. Do I have to go to any of these?
We'll do it this one. This time.
We thank each of you for your patience this morning, now afternoon. We apologize to you. What we'd like to do, if we could, is to begin with you, Mr. Wertheimer. You are the driving force behind the campaign finance movement in this country, and we believe you're going to be extremely helpful to us in the formulation of our legislation. Whenever you feel comfortable, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I assume the full statements will be put in the record.
Your statement and all of the other witnesses' complete written statements will be included in the record in their entirety without objection.
Thank you, and we very much appreciate the opportunity to testify and the fact that this subcommittee is holding these hearings. I think, as everyone recognizes, television today plays a central role in our national elections. It's the medium by which most voters get their information today and by which federal candidates communicate directly to their constituents, provided they have the substantial resources necessary to do so. Television has had a profound impact on the cost of campaigns and the way they are conducted, on the ever-increasing role of private influence money in financing congressional contests, and on the increasingly one-sided political debate in America, as inadequately financed challengers have been pushed off the playing field. As the Senate Commerce Committee has noted, witnesses at both the 1988 and 1989 committee hearings stated that the cost of airtime is so high that it distorts the campaign process, it limits what the candidate pays and what the electorate hears, it makes it much more difficult for a challenger to run against an incumbent. The airwaves belong to the public. Broadcasters are licensed to use the airwaves by the public through its government. With the license comes the responsibility and obligation to exercise it in the public's interest. It's long been recognized that a part of the public responsibility of broadcasters lies in the area of elections, the core of our system of representative government. Broadcasters have been required by statute to make reasonable amounts of time available for purchase by federal candidates and to provide such access to all candidates in a race. Broadcasters since 1972 also have been required to sell all time to candidates at a statutorily mandated rate, namely the lowest unit rate made available to commercial customers. What has become very clear, however, is that the public's needs and the broadcasters' responsibilities in this area go beyond existing statutory requirements. The current system of financing congressional elections is patently unfair and discredited with the American people. As the Keating 5 case has starkly demonstrated, the need to change the way campaigns are financed is the overriding government ethics issue facing our political system today. Incumbents, furthermore, now have such an extraordinary advantage over challengers in raising money and in their ability to communicate with voters that we are losing our ability to have real elections for Congress. In 1990, for example, House incumbents had $239 million available in campaign resources, 6.5 times more than the available campaign funds for challengers of $37 million. The defunding of House challengers that has occurred is perhaps most clearly illustrated by what's happened over the last 10 years. In 1980, House challengers raised $36 million. 10 years later, for the 1990 election, they raised $37 million. That is no growth. House incumbents, meanwhile, went from raising $72 million in 1980 to $181 million in 1990. In other words, $110 million more was given in 1990 than in 1980 in these races, and $109 million of that amount went to incumbents. Representative Gadenson earlier on testified about the fact that there aren't that many House members using television now, and therefore we should not be tilting the system towards it. I think recognizing the fact, and it's true that, that Senate campaigns involve much greater use of television. Nevertheless, House campaigns do use television, and the reason it is not being used today, the primary reason is that there aren't campaigns. For most races, most challengers simply do not have any money. Certainly don't have any money to run campaigns on television. While incumbents have more money than they need, but no need to spend the money on television. Representative Barton mentioned earlier that he thought this system was working well, and he doesn't use much television. Well, in the last election, Representative Barton raised $700,000, spent $400,000. His challenger raised $6,300 and spent $4,000. So that's $400,000 versus $4,000. I understand the sense of the system working well, but it may be working well for individuals. I don't think it's working well as a system, not working well for the country, and not working well in terms of the notion of having any sense of real elections at this point. The issue involved here is not one of electing challengers or defeating incumbents. It's just the basic question of whether the system today is providing American voters with real choices and real elections on Election Day. In order to deal with these problems, Congress has to enact comprehensive campaign reform, and comprehensive reform requires addressing the role and cost of television in our campaigns. This has been recognized in the Senate recently, both by the passage of S3, comprehensive reform legislation which deals with the television issue, and by the introduction of alternative legislative proposals. It has also been recognized in H.R. 1177, comprehensive campaign reform legislation introduced by Representatives Mike Sinar, Dan Glickman, Jim Leach, Matt McHugh, and others, which similarly addresses the importance of dealing with the role of television. The Senate bill in H.R. 1177 build on the existing statutory requirement to provide candidates with the lowest unit rate. First, by rewriting the definition of lowest unit rate to make it effective, then by requiring that general election candidates who agree to spending limits will be required to be sold time by broadcasters during the election period at a discounted rate equal to 50% of the lowest unit rate charge. These measures, along with provisions that provide for eligible candidates with publicly funded vouchers to acquire television time, would bring about major reductions in the most expensive cost in campaigns today, and thereby reduce the demand for the private influence money that is paying for these expenditures. And I would just add that the point that Mr. Ailes made about the need for some kind of benchmark for that lowest unit rate, and perhaps looking at the average over a 52-week period, I think is a very important one for this subcommittee to consider. These measures would help address the extraordinary imbalance that exists today in campaign resources between incumbents and challengers by substantially increasing the opportunity for challengers to communicate with voters. Others, including Senators Dole and Simpson and Representative Bliley of this subcommittee, have proposed placing an even greater responsibility on broadcasters in recognition of their obligation as licensees of the public airwaves. S7, introduced by Senators Dole and Simpson, for example, would provide candidates for the Senate in the general election with substantial amounts of broadcast time whose cost would be borne exclusively by the broadcasters. Both of these approaches, the one contained in S3, H.R. 1177, or the free television approach, correctly recognize, in our view, the central role played by television and its costs in the problems facing our political system today, and the responsibility of broadcasters as licensees of the public's airways to help solve these problems. In summary, we believe it's essential that comprehensive campaign reform legislation be enacted, and that the issue of television and the cost of television be addressed as part of that legislation. We strongly urge this subcommittee to support proposals similar to the proposals in S3 and H.R. 1177, which will reduce the exceptional cost of television in campaigns and the demand for private political money to pay for it, improve the ability of challengers to communicate and compete for federal office, and increase the accountability of candidates in communicating through television. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now recognize Norman Ornstein, who is a resident scholar from the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome, Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start with a general caution, following a little bit on what Bill Brock said in the last panel and some of what you were saying earlier as well. This subcommittee has done an enormous amount of work on emerging technologies in telecommunications, and I think we have to recognize to start with that the technology is changing with awesome speed. The role and uses of television technology and telecommunications technology in general in politics and campaigns is going to change along with it. As you think about regulating this process, don't just think about where we are today. Think ahead 5 years or 10 years. These regulations will apply. And I think we're going to find that enough will have changed in terms of the use of technology that the regulation simply will be much more difficult in its ability to achieve its goals, and that suggests some real caution as we look ahead. We're seeing, with the expansion of cable, the use of satellites, the expansion of public access, the use of videos, and as the cost and distribution of those comes down and expands, as we see telephones used in different ways and computers through telephones and television lines used, methods of communicating with voters are going to shift. And one of the things that's going to happen is, as we try and regulate this process, and as we try and regulate negative campaigns, for example, we're going to find a jumping from one area to another. As you regulate in one area, and clearly you have more leverage and ability to regulate broadcasters who get licenses than you do cable right now, it'll simply shift somewhere else. And one of the reasons I'm very skeptical, for example, about regulating negative campaigns on television is we see these negative campaigns because there's a driving desire to use them because they have tended to work. If you block the ability to use them in some fashion on broadcast television, they'll shift to places where they can't be regulated. They'll shift to cable, and if you find some way to regulate them on cable, they're going to shift to print. And if you regulate the campaigns themselves, they'll shift to independent expenditures. And go to regulate the independent expenditures, they'll shift in other venues. They'll shift to direct mail. They'll move out in ways that won't necessarily be more edifying. They may be less edifying. They may have more of an impact. So we've got to be a little bit careful here, and I think you in particular, because of the work you've done in this area and your expertise in this area, ought to especially think through how technological change might affect political campaigning and how a regulation today is going to play out 10 years from now as all of these things change. That makes me a little bit more skeptical about what we can do and about the consequences of what we'll do, because I suspect we'll simply shift venues and shift strategies. I'm also a little bit skeptical about ways of regulating negative advertising, in part because of the definition of it. Getting back to, it was a very interesting discussion we had about the famous Daisy commercial. I don't see any way in which that particular commercial, if you view it, could be regulated as a negative ad, because it doesn't mention an opponent. It uses the particular candidate. It's also interesting to realize that that commercial was shown once in the state of Ohio. It was not broadcast over and over again. The resonance that that commercial had came because, as it was shown once and then withdrawn, it became a conversation piece all over the country. It was shown on news broadcasts over and over again. It was used in much the same way that the now infamous tape of the Los Angeles police beating the suspect out there has been shown over and over again. It's going to be very difficult to regulate that kind of process in a similar fashion. So I'd be simply cautious here as we move ahead and recognize the sensitivity to technological change, not to mention the law of unintended consequences. Now, as for the costs and what we can do about those and what we can do to enhance the dialogue and get messages across in campaigns, there's no question the costs are high and they've been going up. They are the single largest. They are the single fastest growing. It has been true much more for the Senate than for the House. It's true not just because we don't have challengers running campaigns. Fred has hit on, I think, a very important part of it. It's also true because in so many House campaigns, television simply would not be a cost-effective mechanism to use. And one of the interesting points that Sam Gadenson made this morning is that the amount of television that's used and the cost is much, much higher in markets that are much lower down, because there you can make an effective use and a blanket use of television than you can in others where the costs are much higher. That also suggests some caution, and it suggests that an approach that would be used in the Senate wouldn't necessarily be the appropriate one for use in the House. I would join virtually every other witness who's appeared here so far and support tightening up and altering the definition of lowest per unit cost, making it, as others have said, a preemptible cost for a non-preemptible time. I think it's not a bad idea, if we're going to do something in any fashion about the nature of our campaigns and the campaign dialogue now, to give some additional break for longer spots. If what we want to do is to encourage people to get a dialogue out with the electorate and get messages across, and if television in many cases is a part of that, I have no difficulty with tilting the system slightly so that you encourage candidates to use different kinds of spots. If Bob Squire is right, and the basic reason that people are using 30-second spots now as opposed to 60-second spots or longer spots is that it's a more effective use of your money, because it used to be the case that you could get more reach with the longer spots. Now you get many more mentions with the shorter ones. And I'm a little skeptical about that once you get beyond the 1-minute level. I think people don't use the longer spots because they don't think they'll be watched as much. But if that's true at all, then presumably we can tilt a little bit. I think the Senate tilting as much as it has with the 50% reduction in costs is too much. And I don't want to either encourage candidates to use a whole lot more television than they would have otherwise, not because it'll improve the dialogue, but because it's so much cheaper and easier to do. Nor do I want to do much that would encourage candidates who aren't in to win an election but want to get a message across, who want to rally people who want to move to extreme views, to have so much of an incentive to get into a race because they can get something that they wouldn't have otherwise. So a little tilt, yes. We could probably find a formula that would work, not a lot. I am very much against the use of free time. I'm for it for presidential campaigns. I'm against it not because I have any philosophical objection to it, I just do not think it would work. Presidential campaigns, it can. You've got two candidates. Give them 5 minutes a night or 10 minutes a night each. Put it on as many channels as you can, that's fine. When I think about the possibilities, no matter how you want to work it, of free time in congressional elections, the bureaucratic nightmares raised and the other problems caused simply suggest to me that it would backfire dramatically. Think about how you're going to allocate free time in the New York market, where you've got 40 to 50 candidates with some claim on that market, 40 to 50 districts with what might end up being over 100 candidates. How are you going to do that? Let the parties regulate, as Mr. Bliley's bill would suggest. Well, I look at how the parties, to whatever degree they have gotten involved in campaigns to this point. The notion that that's going to mean the challengers, for example, in races that are open are going to get a lot more consideration, I don't find credible. What parties are going to do is probably similar to what the party committees have done in the past, which is to tilt towards the candidates who are the most powerful. They'll give time to those who are already safe. They won't necessarily work in the right direction. And how you can negotiate between the Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey parties over who would get time strikes me as involving far more problems than it's worth. Then you think about how it would play out. You require stations to give a certain amount of time to candidates in this particular area. What are they going to do? They're probably going to take hour blocks and have candidates going one after the other with a minute or 2 minutes or whatever. Unless you're going to require MTV, ESPN, and every other station to do the same thing, you're not going to get more people paying attention to political messages. You're going to get fewer. They'll turn to other things, because why sit and watch for an hour when you're dealing with 60 candidates who aren't even in districts where you can have a vote, waiting for yours to come on? You're going to turn to something else. And frankly, if you could find some way to regulate it so that every channel in the spectrum, cable and otherwise, ran these things, people would run out to their video stores and there'd be an enormous boom in rentals. This isn't going to increase political dialogue. It's probably in the end going to decrease it, and it's going to create a bureaucratic nightmare of massive proportions. So free time isn't the direction in which we should go. We should find ways to reduce the costs so that we can make it easier for candidates who have an enormous demand to get a message across to be able to do it. Now, as for content regulation of any sort or disclosure, I have some considerable sympathy with the idea of requiring a much greater disclosure of those who are putting ads on the air. And I don't have any great problem with Bart Gordon's idea of having a candidate face on for, say, 4 seconds saying this ad was approved by. I have a small problem with it, which simply is I think it's a slippery slope once we start to get into the regulation of content of these things. Even to that point, it's not going to do very much to change the content of those ads, in my judgment. And we're going to continue to have dissatisfaction with the dialogue, and we'll continue to move in a direction of trying to regulate more that I don't think would work. But I could see doing that, and I could see doing it particularly for independent expenditures. I'm afraid that to whatever degree we regulate regular campaigns, we're going to provide an enormous additional incentive to move out towards independent expenditures, to get around the system in some fashion. The Supreme Court has given a green light to that. We've got to grapple with how we're going to bring that out into the sunshine. I think disclosure is the only way in which we can do it. And I could see a much more justification for having some fuller disclosure in the ads done by independent expenditure groups than others. Finally, Mr. Chairman, let me say, whenever we deal with the question of campaign finance, we're going to have to look much more carefully at how we pay for it. And it is clearly the case, as many of our other witnesses have said, the American people at this point believe basically that public funding of campaigns in any fashion is the equivalent of a pay raise for politicians. They don't want it. We're not going to get anywhere without some public commitment in this process, it's my judgment. I much prefer to do it starting indirectly with tax credits, generous ones for small contributors. I want people to get into the system. You give $50 or $100, you're a part of the political system, and I want to encourage that as much as possible. I'd love matching funds under that system. I don't think it's feasible, given the budget process, the pay-as-you-go system, given the public mood right now, to pay for it through general taxpayer revenues. We've got to search for other ways. Sam Gadenson talked about a fee on all advertising. I've suggested in the past a tax on PACs as one idea. I also would favor something that Mr. Fritz doesn't like very much, which is possibly thinking about a license renewal fee based on some small share of advertising revenues for stations, those who have gotten some benefit out of the system paying a small share back into it. A combination of things where those who have benefited from the system, and I, by the way, wouldn't be against some small tax or some tax on the revenues of political consultants and pollsters either, is probably something that would be acceptable to the public and would at least eat away at the costs of these things that would make it worthwhile.
Thank you, Mr. Ornstein. And we'll take your final minute or so as an introduction for Mr. Jerry Fritz, who is Vice President for All Britain Communications Company, but more importantly today, speaking for the National Association of Broadcasters, that is all of the broadcasters in the United States, who clearly have a real stake in this issue and how we resolve it. And your testimony will be very helpful to us in helping to sort out this puzzle. So whenever you feel comfortable, please begin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by reviewing the stakes involved in political advertising from both the candidates and the broadcaster's perspective. As Congressman Gadenson mentioned this morning, his own study and an LA Times study earlier this year showed that, contrary to accepted wisdom, only 25% of the cost of the average House race was spent on advertising, and that figure includes production costs and commissions. Compare that 25% to a broadcast station which receives from 2 to 5% of its annual revenue from political ads, mostly in the critical fourth quarter of the year. The point being that legislation designed to provide candidates with free or cut-rate advertising would do less than expected to lower the overall cost of political campaigns, while at the same time substantially affecting broadcasters' sole source of revenue. The Primary Communications Act provision at issue, of course, is the lowest unit charge clause of Section 315. This requires the station to provide all candidates with rates equal to those paid by the station's best commercial advertisers for the same class and the same time. As is sometimes the case, these federal rules are often out of sync with the realities of the marketplace. But 2 points need to be made. First, the way time is sold today is radically different than when Section 315 and the FCC rules were adopted. Candidates expect a discount in the cost of their spots at the time they place an order. But because of the fluid way in which time is sold today, broadcasters in many cases don't know what the discount will be until after the program airs. This creates enormous paperwork and time burdens for both the broadcaster and the candidates, having to administer a very complex rebate system, and that satisfies no one. Second, it's crucial to the theme of this hearing to understand that just because broadcast ads are cheaper does not mean campaigns will be. Time buyers spend what they have. They want their candidates on the air in accordance with a predetermined formula, and frankly, they don't care what it costs. Mr. Chairman, this clash between rules and reality is not helped by the FCC's interpretation of the lowest unit charge and reasonable access rules. They are, at the very least, oblique and virtually hidden from the vast majority of broadcasters. Even so, I'm confident that almost all broadcasters are doing their level best to comply with the spirit and the intent of the current rules. Fortunately, the Commission recognizes the problem with its interpretations, and as a result is scheduled today to issue a rulemaking clarifying this complex area for candidates and broadcasters alike. The FCC has also taken steps to halt state court lawsuits spawned by some of its actions by intervening in these cases to exercise its exclusive authority. Mr. Chairman, as this subcommittee reviews any changes to the current political system, I hope you'll take into account the following observations. First, political advertising proposals are likely to raise significant constitutional questions. Attached to my written testimony is a legal analysis commissioned by the NAB. The analysis questions the constitutionality of the current law. It concludes that most, if not all, of the changes proposed in the legislation are unconstitutional. My next point concerns free time. Broadcasters strongly believe in our responsibility to provide voters with informative discussions of campaign issues. Yet in virtually every NAB survey, 2 points are clear. First, stations voluntarily provide candidates significant blocks of free time already through debates, extensive news coverage, and political affairs program. However, a number of candidates choose not to take advantage of these opportunities, especially debates. Many campaigns want to use free time only if they can control the spin. Beyond those concerns and the constitutional problems I mentioned, free time also imperils a station's ability to operate, since it would significantly reduce the station's only source of income, advertising. Nevertheless, the NAB is willing to accept changes to the broadcast rules. Candidates and broadcasters need rules which are simple and easy to interpret and implement. Candidates also need assurances that the rates they will receive are fair and equitable, and broadcasters need to retain adequate advertising revenue to sustain their operations. Let me describe 2 concepts the NAB can live with. First is one that was proposed in the last Congress by Representative Swift. It abolishes lowest unit rate, but gives candidates 1 free spot for every 2 spots bought at full price. This dramatically simplifies the process for broadcasters, for time buyers, for candidates, and even for the FCC. The second is incorporated in S-521, bipartisan legislation introduced by Senators Danforth, Hollings, and Inouye, which was approved by the Senate Commerce Committee and was included as an amendment to S-3, the Senate-passed campaign reform bill. This legislation simply allows candidates bump-free carriage of their spots at lowest preemptible rates. If this subcommittee determines that a broadcast provision is necessary to the campaign reform package, we urge you to consider one of these 2 approaches. But under any circumstances, we'll be happy to work with you in the process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fritz, very much. Let me recognize first the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Harris, for a round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I certainly want to associate myself with most of the remarks that Mr. Ornstein made, that in our quest to get public involvement, whether we're talking about candidate involvement or whether we're talking about voter involvement, I think one of the things we have to address is the cost of elections. And, but I don't see that thrust getting more involvement of the public if we're looking at public financing. Because the people that I talk to back home, they're concerned, one, about the cost of campaigns, and but they sure are not interested in shelling out of their own pocket to pay for them. And so I think we've got to look to other ways to get that involvement and to look at the cost. I think the tax credit idea is a good one, and to get more of the little guys and gals involved and give them some incentive to do that. And of course, you know, in the budgetary problems that we've got today, any tax credit that we hand out, it's a revenue loser. You got to look for other ways to find it, to pay for it, and so you've got to balance that out. But Mr. Wertheimer, I know that you've been very supportive of the public financing concept, but it's not one that the people back in my part of the state think very much of, and I don't know whether you've got any other thoughts on that you might have that I could convey to my constituents, but they're not excited at all. And I think the idea of the thought that Mr. Squire put forward too, that even at the presidential level with the checkoff not bringing in the funds, that we're going to have a deficit there, that they're going to look to the General Treasury. And certainly, if you add on a burden of financing congressional campaigns too, then you're going to have that added burden. So I certainly am supportive of campaign reform and cost reform. And I know the idea has been floated about some sort of constitutional action that would get around the Supreme Court decision about the limitation of spending. Of course, we know that takes some time if we get into that process, but I don't find a lot of support for the idea of the taxpayers financing the elections.
If I could comment on that.
Yes, sir.
We have long felt and strongly believe that public financing is a central component of reforming the campaign finance system.
Nobody seems to think
it deals with a number of things. It deals with the extraordinary imbalance between incumbents and challengers, an imbalance that comes about primarily today because of the interest in people who are providing the money, giving it to people who hold power, and those are not challengers. It deals with providing a substitute for the resources that presently come in. It also is part of what is necessary in order to limit spending. With respect to the presidential checkoff system, the principal reason that it is having problems today in the long term, there will be enough money in that system for 1992, is because of a structural problem. Even given the limited number who check off, the spending from that system in 1974 was indexed. The money going in was not. So the outflow from presidential public financing has increased 261%, while the checkoff has stayed the same. If the checkoff had been indexed as well as the spending, there would be a $150 million surplus in that system. On the issue of congressional races, as I said, we strongly support public financing, or, to put it another way, ways of providing alternative resources to candidates so that they do not have to depend on the money that is presently funding races. That can come in a number of ways, and public funding can be defined in a number of ways. The resources for those funds could come from the checkoff, but they could come from something much more narrowly defined, which would not be directly related to taxpayers' funds. On the Senate side, the proposal for public funding was limited to either taxation on political action committees or removing the present business deduction for lobbying. The latter, for example, would bring in $500 million over 5 years, according to an initial estimate on the Senate side. There are ways, in other words, of determining the source of the funds which would limit it, even though from our perspective, public financing is the best investment that American citizens can make. You talk about citizens do not want to deal with the cost of paying for campaigns, but I think that has to be looked at in the context of what the cost is of the way we pay for campaigns today. And we would submit that that potential cost to taxpayers is far, far greater than what the cost would be of a public financing system. Again, we have looked at various forms of alternative resources, including a continuing role for private contributions. We've supported 100% tax credits. We've supported low-cost mail or reduced-cost mail. We've supported discounted TV. We've supported public funds, and a combination of these as a way of moving away from the present system. And in this context, the notion of a 50% discount in the cost of TV would very substantially address. It couldn't do it by itself. It'd be a very important component of changing the makeup of the way campaigns are paid for today. One last point. The proposal, I would just like to say that the proposal that was endorsed here of 2 ads, paying for 2 ads and getting 3, in and of itself simply won't change the system because there's no control on what the cost of those 2 ads are. There would be absolutely nothing to prevent a broadcaster from figuring out the cost of 3 ads, charging that cost to someone for 2 ads and giving them a 3rd one. So that I do not think that would work in dealing with this issue.
Let me just add a couple of comments, if I might. The checkoff, of course, in many respects, as a funding source, is a sham. It doesn't raise any money. It is simply there. People check off that $1 of the taxes that they otherwise would pay go into a fund. Under the current pay-as-you-go budget rules, you can't use that to pay for funding of congressional campaigns. You can't expand the checkoff to $3 or $4 or $5 or whatever and have that pay because you're not raising a dime. You're shuffling it from one account to another. So that's not going to work, and some of the discussion of that in the Senate was pie in the sky. We've got to find a different, distinct source of funding under the current pay-as-you-go system. I'm for having some public participation here. I much prefer to have it start with incentives for small contributions because it seems to me one of our goals is to get people into the political process. I'm delighted if we can raise enough revenue to have matching funds that go along with that once candidates get over a threshold to show that they're serious about it. But if we don't address very directly how we're going to pay for it now in a way that's acceptable to your constituents in Alabama and others around the country, we're not going to get anywhere in the end. We've got to find a source or a combination of sources of revenue that people at least will say are appropriate for this particular purpose, whatever they may be. You can think of others.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask Mr. Ornstein and Mr. Wertheimer. I'm a co-sponsor of Mr. Sinar's bill. I think it's probably the best approach. I'm not entirely convinced that it's perfect, but nothing is. But my concern is this, and Mr. Ornstein, you have studied the Congress for many years, and we all respect you. You know the differences between the House and the Senate. We're a different breed of animals. Some of us would like to get to the Senate, but apart from that, House members spend less money on television, less House races. What is it? A third fund television. No television is not a factor. All Senate races virtually do. They run every 6 years. We run every 2. The Senate, for instance, has passed some legislation that they know is totally unworkable, and that's the elimination of PACs. I mean, whether you think that's right or wrong, that's not the issue. The fact is that that's not going to emerge in the final product. You're not going to eliminate PAC. It's an easy way to take a cheap vote and look good to your constituents. You don't have to run every 6 years. My point is this: should there not be, why don't we have something that is realistic, that applies to the House and applies to the Senate? perhaps fairly similar. But aren't we really talking institutionally about two different contexts of advertising, of requirements, of we're basically different. That we are viewed by the people as the closest agents to them. We run every 2 years. You know, for all the garbage that's dumped on us, and includes Mr. Wertheimer, I sometimes resent that we are viewed as in the pockets of everybody. We go to the people. I mean, I've had 1,500 town meetings in 7 years since I've been in Congress. And I don't feel that because somebody contributes to my campaign that they have bought anything. So, Mr. Ornstein?
You've raised a number of issues. And let me address at least a few of them. First, I applaud Sam Gadenson's strategy of basically saying the Senate is different. They want to devise a system that'll work for them. God bless them. Let them go ahead and do it, and we'll do our own. In part, there is no question that many in the Senate have had the idea that they could take some votes that were popular and let the House bail them out, and then turn around and criticize the House. It's a strategy from the pay raise that we know has been applied before, and keeping their feet to the fire I don't find unacceptable at all. And I think it has, it's not just for that reason, it is for legitimate reasons relating to the different nature of campaigns. No question, as Fred has said, television is not used in a lot of House campaigns because there's no need to, because you don't have any significant contest. But there's also no question that House races are intrinsically different, that television is simply not applicable, it's not cost effective, it's not a good means of communicating in a number of other places. And when you add to that what I said at the beginning of my testimony, as we think about how technology is changing, simply focusing on this now is going to beg the question of what kind of communications and campaigns will be appropriate in 5 years or 10 years, because it'll be very much different. So this is a significant component. I'd handle it differently in the House. I wouldn't have a 50% discount. I could see it as being more relevant for the Senate. Even there, I'm a little more uneasy about it because of unintended consequences that could ensue. But I don't see any particular reason for it. I'd reduce the costs here as much as I can, but a different system in this case, absolutely fine. Beyond that, let me just make a couple of general comments in response to what you said, Congressman Richardson. I see several goals out of campaign finance reform. Cleaning up the system, getting away from special interest domination is one, but it's only one. Ending the money chase, or ending people's obsession with raising money that takes time for everybody, challengers and incumbents. You guys spend far too much time thinking about raising money that ought to be spent in legislative affairs. That's another. Getting people more involved in the political process is another. Encouraging good candidates to run and getting the best people we possibly can to enter politics and not having barriers to keep them out is another. And there are others. I want to look at every element of a campaign finance program searchingly with those goals in mind. I'm one who joins with most of the academic experts, frankly, in campaign finance and being very skeptical about spending limits.
As Mr. Wertheimer answers my question, let me also throw this question to Mr. Wertheimer. What is the difference, Mr. Wertheimer, between several PACs that contribute to my candidacy at $1,000 a year and 150 private wealthy individuals that give $1,000 in one event to one candidate? In other words, I can tell you that if people, a constituent that gives you $1,000, many times they will lay greater claim to you on your vote or your views than a PAC. I can tell you that, and I'm sure you know this, that that individual that is glorified in this process of campaign reform, and I'm for the small contributors, but you know, you can get a picnic and you can get 150 wealthy individuals, you'll get 1,000 each, and it shows no PAC money, but then you've got another event with PACs, and you're talking about who's exerting influence. I'm not saying that we don't need to reform the process, but I'd like to...
Well, the answer is they both may well be problems. Charles Keating demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt how individual contributions can be used to aggregate large sums of money and give them to members of Congress who he was quite interested in influencing. That, in fact, is why the bill that you are co-sponsoring, that Representative Sinar has introduced, deals with both of them. It would cut the role of PACs and it would cut the role of individual contributions and make private contributions more important by providing tax credits, by making them matchable with vouchers that are not limited to television. Unlike the Senate, the House approach it reflects the fact that television may not be as important in some races, and so the voucher could be used for newspaper ads or postage, other kinds of events. But I think the H.R. 1177 is designed to greatly enhance the role of the small private contributor and to reduce the role of PACs and wealthy individual contributors, and I believe that should be done. I think the House bill is and should be in certain areas different than the Senate because the problems are different. But let me, if I could finish my answer on this. There is one thing, however, that I think you do have to keep in mind, and that is that when it comes to PAC contributions, they favor incumbents far more than other contributions. In 1990, political action committees gave $87 million to House incumbents and $7 million to challengers. That's a 12-to-1 ratio. All other money given to House candidates in those races was a 3-to-1 ratio. Now, what's driving that is the fact that they're part of an organized lobbying effort.
My question. I think probably now, after I've heard all of these witnesses, the best thing to do if you really want to reform the process, and I know it's probably not going to happen, is just get money totally out of politics. Just forget any kind of contributors, because if you think that individual contributors, small contributors, checkoffs don't have an influence in the process, you're wrong. Everybody wants a piece of everything we do. You know, we might as well just get rid of prohibit all funding of campaigns. Let everybody run on their records and the stumps of trees behind trains. Don't spend any money. I think if that is our goal, probably that's the best way to do it. But
I found myself a little frustrated by the Senate's action on PACs, which I thought was largely grandstanding. But one of the things that's clear to me is that the largest reason that we have this great disparity in PAC contributions is incumbents have found that it is the easiest and most efficient way to raise money. As we've lowered individual contribution limits and created all kinds of other barriers, they're here, by and large. You can pull them together. Their business is giving money. If you eliminate them, we're not going to lessen people's obsession with raising money. We're going to increase it, because then candidates will get on the phone with lists of the members of the boards of directors and members of the executive committees and call them individually and solicit money. That alone is not going to be a solution unless we can find another source of money that is readily available, politically and publicly acceptable, that will balance against it. And simply calling for elimination or drastic reduction isn't going to alter the role of these agents in any fashion, except possibly to make more headaches.
Gentleman's time has expired. I just note to the gentleman, although it's probably politically impossible, to the gentleman from New Mexico, that I, for one, support full public funding of congressional campaigns. I think in the end, the public would get a bargain, because everyone in public office would spend much less time trying to raise money. There'd be fewer conflicts, and I think the members ultimately would be more independent-minded in terms of how these public policy decisions were made once people were elected. But we all understand that that's highly unlikely, although from my perspective, that's the most desirable result, which we could, in fact, produce from all of this debate that we have on campaign finance reform. My time has expired. I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Bryant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have supported the public financing and a variety of versions of it and limits on contributors and PACs and so forth over the years, and I still do and will again for all the reasons that have been well articulated by the witnesses here. But I think that as long as there is the great need for money in campaigns, there's always going to be a move afoot to find a creative way to get that money in, some way or another, independent financing. I don't know what it'll be, but whatever this next law we pass says, somebody will be trying to find a way around it, which is why I've pushed this idea that you may have been in the room hearing me talk about earlier, that we ought to say, with regard to the most expensive of all campaign techniques, and this business about we only use TV ads in 1/3 of the races, I think it's for the very reason that Mr. Wertheimer said a moment ago. I mean, that is because in many of these areas you don't run any kind of a campaign at all. But if you're going to be in a campaign, you've got to have the money for the TV set, TV ads. I'd like to ask you to comment upon my suggestion that we restrict the use of television to the talking head. That is to say, you can't go on TV and talk about yourself or your opponent unless it's you. You've got to talk and you have to say it yourself, which I think would substantially reduce the perceived need for the offensive ad and the defensive ad, and for goodness sakes, might begin to relieve some of the remove some of the inertia on public debate and legislative voting, which results from fear of the 30-second attack ad that can't be responded to adequately. Mr. Ornstein?
Well, I wish it would work, John. I just don't think it can work for a variety of reasons. First of all, I'm not sure that you can regulate in that fashion across all broadcast media. And I'm not sure how you can manage to do it constitutionally, limit in that fashion. Secondly, if you could, basically candidates who want to get messages across would find other means of doing it. We'd see independent expenditures increase dramatically. And unless you can pass a constitutional amendment to obviate the Supreme Court's decision, you're not going to be able to do that. Secondly, we'd see videos being made. We'd see technology move in and be used by candidates to have the same effect, but just through different media. Given the cost that you have just in terms of regulating the dialogue of a campaign in that fashion, and you pay a price for it. If we can get a benefit for it, I'm willing to consider that price. But given that I'm skeptical that we'd be able to actually change the dialogue in any substantial way, I'm afraid it's not going to work. I wish it would.
Mr. Wertheimer?
2 points I'd make. First, on your first point about that people are always going to be creatively looking for ways around the laws. There's no question about that. But that doesn't mean we can't create a system that is far better than what we have now and then struggle with whatever efforts people come up with. And Chairman Brock earlier said he couldn't for the life of him see why there are limits on party spending and contributions. Well, there's a pretty simple reason why there are. I mean, to prevent laundering of contributions through parties, which went on in the 1988 election to the degree of tens of millions of dollars. So that Charles Keating or Donald Trump, who couldn't give $100,000 to President Bush's campaign, simply ran it through the parties. Same thing happened on the Democratic side. On your proposal, all I can say is that I'm sympathetic to everything that's motivating what you're talking about. I question, however, whether we can do it. I just think that when you get to that level of content control, we're probably going too far in terms of trying to get into the control of the way elections are conducted. I think what you're touching there is part of what is very much upsetting the American people. The comments of Mr. Ailes and Mr. Squire notwithstanding, these ads they're self-destructive. They're taken out today mostly by incumbents who in effect attack the system, attack themselves in doing it, but simply think about it in terms of attacking the challengers. They don't, as you point out, they don't have to play a role in it, and yet they create that atmosphere that lasts after the campaign and while you try to govern. I mean, it contributes, I think, tremendously towards the notion that everything in this town is negative and everything in politics is negative. But I question whether you can do it by a talking heads requirement. There are provisions such as contained in H.R. 1177 and others which would contribute to what you're trying to accomplish. The requirement for the candidate to personally take responsibility at the end of the ad and to state That the candidate had agreed or had authorized the ad is one way. The requirement in return for vouchers that the ads be of a longer content, 1 minute to 5 minutes, also might address that.
Well, let me say that if any of those restrictions are constitutional, then the proposal that I've made would as well be constitutional. I think one way to approach it is to say, very much as we do now with the disclaimer, which everybody tags on to the end of their ads, that if you want the preferential rate, it's got to be you talking. If you want to go pay the outrageous price for TV advertising and also the outrageous price for the services of Mr. Ailes and Mr. Squires, I suppose you could do so. I don't think the attempt is to regulate the content, but the manner of usage. If you want to, you can say whatever you want to, yes or no. I'd finally like to conclude with one statement. I have viewed myself for 17 years in public office in the legislature and Congress as being a supporter and admirer of Common Cause and all that it stands for over the years, and I suspect that I voted along with your organization for nearly every time anything's been presented. 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, you all ran a series of ads in this country, around the country, in the districts of incumbent members who had, according to you, received some money from savings and loan executives or people related to savings and loans. I was not the victim of any of these ads, but I saw them. You ran them in many cases against members of Congress who had voted 100% of the time against the savings and loan industry's lobbying position. And it stood up when it was time to stand up. Members who had received $1,000, $2,000, $5,000 out of their total campaign fund from somebody who was in some way related to a savings and loan. I think that was a very unfortunate mistake on your part, a mistake in judgment. I don't think he should have done it. I think it bordered on being dishonest, and I think it was a betrayal of all that Common Cause has stood for over the years. Those members, you I think, have the obligation to tell both sides if you're going to come to us and urge us to be in favor of legislation, campaign finance reform that allows both sides to get its message out at election time. And I wanted to just end with that kind admonition to your organization. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just briefly respond. Sure. I appreciate your comments. We have on occasion run ads. We've rarely run them. These were newspaper ads. They dealt with the savings and loan scandal and the problems of Congress in terms of not dealing with the campaign finance issue. They were focused on lobbying for campaign finance reform, and we felt those ads were appropriate, and were making the case about the failure of the Congress and the individual members in Congress to deal with a fundamental problem, the problem we're still here discussing today. I appreciate your comments.
But you directly suggested that those members, who are some of the finest members here, who voted against the savings and loans, were somehow part of the savings and loan scandal, and were themselves somehow part of stopping the passage of campaign finance reform, and in many cases that was most clearly not the case, and you should not have done that.
Well, I don't believe we did that, but I understand your comments, Representative Bryan.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Scheuer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm left, after listening to this panel, with a profound sense of disquietude and disappointment and unease. I consider the need to raise substantial six-figure money for congressional campaigns a totally offensive and obnoxious and utterly unpleasant responsibility. The only thing about being a congressman that I really don't enjoy at all. It's terrible. All of us are aware of the problems. You've discussed them brilliantly in this panel of trying to raise money and maintaining your integrity and preserving the integrity of the system. Yet, I listened to Fred Wertheim's recommendations, and in my own mind, as he ticked them off, I said, that's not going to fly, that's not going to fly, that's not going to fly. And then, when I and then after that, when I heard Norman Ornstein, whom we all respect and admire, and we've met with him many times at our annual issues conference and so forth. He's totally aware of the problem. And he sort of reaffirmed that most of the recommendations of Fred Wertheim weren't going to fly, weren't practicable. The tick-off, the public financing of campaigns is just totally unacceptable to the public, no matter what we may think. As idealists and scholars and practitioners, we may know how important it is, but the public doesn't feel it is important for them to pick up the tab for political campaigns. So I'm cudgeling my wits, Norman, to figure out where do we go from here. There's such a congeries, there's such a collection of obstacles and roadblocks to doing something meaningful to move towards some kind of reform of the inordinate burden of campaign financing, particularly television. But it seems that for every reaction there's an equal and opposite reaction. In fact, it's an unequal and opposite reaction, many times more powerful than the reaction. After all of these hours of discussion, can you tell us, A, what you think a couple of useful approaches would be, and if there are roadblocks there that we could remove without damage to the Constitution, what are they? I'd like to go out of here in an up frame of mind, and I think your testimony has been brilliant. It's come from the heart, but it's knocked down, it seems to me, just about every proposal that's been made across the spectrum, including most of the suggestions that Fred Wertheim made.
Well, I'm not quite as pessimistic, Congressman Scheuer. I'm a little uneasy about the direction in which we're going just because of the nature of White House, congressional, Democratic, Republican politics right now. There are an awful lot of people who like to see this sort of get up to the brink and then fade away, especially as we approach an election which people are profoundly nervous and don't want to see the rules change. Over the longer run, though, and even in this Congress, it seems to me, as I've seen the dialogue develop, and I think it's changed a lot in the last 2 or 3 years. I think we've moved beyond some glib proposals to looking at them a little more realistically. And I think even looking at the debate in the Senate, where Republicans have been, for example, totally against any kind of public funding of campaigns, when you start to talk about tax credits and even matching funds, and when you start to talk about spending limits in a more flexible way, as the task force did, where you tilt the system towards smaller individual contributions, there's some common ground there. There's an ability to move forward. If we can find a source of funding, and we're not talking about a huge sum of money here. That's the most ironic aspect of all of this. We've got a $5.5 trillion economy and a $1.4 trillion budget. We're talking about, if we stretch it pretty dramatically, a couple $100 million in an election cycle, maybe $300 million, if we want to fund some of the most desirable things that we could have. That's not a lot of money, and I think we can find a way that doesn't simply take it out of the general treasury.
May I interrupt you for just one moment and ask our colleague from the industry, what are the industry's gross revenues, and what percentage of that would equal the $300 million? I have the feeling that when you say that your political advertising revenues come to 5% of your total revenues, that there could be some reduction in that, a significant reduction in that, without really hurting the financial feasibility and stability of your industry. And can you tell us what the total revenues of the industries are, so we can sort of figure in our minds, well, how does 300 million compared to the billions? What is the figure?
I'm not sure I have the figure of the total revenue for the industry. It would vary certainly between television and radio, large markets and small markets. I can say this, that
now, can you give us a figure in billions or tens of billions?
I'm sorry, I don't have that information. I can get it for you.
Could you supply that for
Sure. One point to be made there, though, that while it might not affect the industry as a whole, as has been pointed out, This is a rapidly evolving industry, tremendously fragmented in recent years. Some stations in smaller markets just hanging on. Recognize that most of this political spending comes in the very critical fourth quarter to broadcast stations.
All right. Look, I interrupted Norman Ornstein to get a specific figure. I didn't get the figure, but perhaps you'll be kind enough to supply that to the committee. Norman, I didn't mean to interfere. Please continue.
That's all right. I was looking for the figure which I had here, but it's a lot of money. I mean, we're talking into the tens of billions of dollars in terms of overall revenues. The amount of campaign revenues that's involved here is less than 5%. I think it's 1 to 2%.
Let me make this point. If it was 3 tens of billions of dollars, if it was 30 billion, then 300 million would be 1%. The total amount that's spent, that is spent on political advertising would be about 1% of revenues. Let's say it's in the neighborhood of a fraction of a 1% to perhaps 1 or 2%. It seems to me there's a room there. Now, I understand there's a lot of diversity out there. I understand that these expenditures come in that critical fourth quarter. But having said all that, it seems to me that there might be a more giving, less unyielding opposition to some contribution by the industry in return for their use of the public's airwaves. And it seems to me that that might very well be a target of opportunity. When we're asking you to make some adjustment in the flow of revenue that you get from political campaigns that amounts to either a fraction of 1% or perhaps 1 or 2% of your total revenues, it seems to me that there ought to be room for some compromise there and from some giving on the part of the industry. Norman, would please continue.
I think that we could find a number of other sources too. What Sam had talked about was a small tax on all advertising revenues. 1/4 of 1% would raise $500 million over 5 years. That would defray the cost considerably as well. There are probably a lot of different ways, but in part I wanted to simply offer the caution that we'd better look for a source of funding explicitly now and not leave that until the end when we go through this process. Assuming we can do that, and we can start and build upon a system that has generous tax credits and, one would hope, matching funds, and we can find ways of tilting the system towards those kinds of contributions and away from the others, we can regulate soft money in some fashion. Although I think we have to recognize, too, that a lot of the things that we do to achieve positive goods do have negative consequences that will hurt parties. Not all of that money is laundered. Some of it does go for legitimate party-building purposes. It's always a trade-off. We can do some things that would create a positive effect on the system, that would enhance the ability of candidates to get their messages across. I've also favored a kind of seed money mechanism where you can let all candidates, challengers or incumbents, get money early on with larger individual contribution limits so that you defray those costs and can get an opportunity to begin a campaign. We could get better people into the system. We could reduce people's obsession with raising money without getting away from the reality that it does cost a lot of money to get messages across in this society. That's one of the problems I have with spending limits, frankly, as a basis of this system. We can get something done. I don't think it's as bad as you believe.
Thank you, Norman. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. We now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Sinar, who, along with 3 or 4 other members in the House, will be considered to have been the architects of the legislation as it emerges from the House of Representatives. That is the comprehensive package of campaign finance reform, and he just happens to as well be a member of the subcommittee on telecommunications. So we recognize Mike Sinar from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me apologize for not being here earlier. I had another hearing I was chairing over in the Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources Committee, and I heard that it was a very excellent first panel. Let me ask a couple of questions here, since the real focus of this is the broadcasting element of campaign finance reform. Norm, we're talking about discounts here in order to try to make it attractive that people would agree to a spending limit. Do you believe that if we have discounts that allow people to get access into the media cheaper, that will improve the quality of the debate, or will it just mean that there is more debate?
In general, I think the idea of a discount is a good one. I'd like to defray the costs. It seems to me when you look at the obsession with money in campaigns, you've got to look at the demand side as well as the supply side. Spending limit looks at the supply side. Reducing the costs looks at the demand side. There's going to be less demand for it if you've got an ability to raise it. Now, how much less demand? Probably not a whole lot. No question, if people are going to try and raise as much as they possibly can to get out there, and if the costs are reduced very substantially, we'll just see a lot more advertising out there. Now, that means you've got to strike a balance, it seems to me.
You don't think that we would move back to a 60-second commercial versus 30-second, which would add additional information?
I start with embracing enthusiastically the notion of a lowest unit cost that is based on preemptible time that's non-preemptible. I'll go for an additional discount for longer commercials to try and encourage those. I don't want to go to a 50% discount as the Senate did, because it seems to me if you get the cost down too much, we have a lot of negative consequences. One of the negative consequences is going to be that the Lyndon LaRouches of the world are going to jump into campaigns because they'll have an open opportunity to get messages across. Not people with the idea of running to win, but exploiting the system. So I want to strike an appropriate balance. I also believe that you need far more in terms of an incentive, far more, to get spending limits of any fashion workable than just this. You've got to do something where you can provide enough money, given the nature of our society, where there's so many messages out there in different ways, people who aren't paying a whole lot of attention to politics in the first place, to be able for a candidate to get a message across. So that's a starting point, and nothing more. One other small point, just to answer the question that Mr. Scheuer had raised. I just found the figure.
Well, why don't you...
$22.6 billion raised in advertising revenues for broadcast television in 1990.
All right. Fred, Sam Gadenson earlier, I'm told, made the following statement, that it's not the amount of money that's spent on TV that determines who wins or loses, that there's no correlation between winners and losers on what's spent on TV. In fact, there may be an inverse correlation. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, not in that context. I mean, people spend an awful lot of time chasing an awful lot of money because they feel that money is important in order to run campaigns. Now, part of that importance plays up and shows up in money spent on television. And as I mentioned earlier, it's somewhat different in the House than the Senate, but I would venture to say that if you had well-financed challengers as opposed to no-financed challengers, you'd have a very different circumstance. You can't do direct correlations, but the use of money as a way of buying ways of communicating is central to campaigns, and television is a central part of it. So I don't agree with that, and we do not agree with the notion that we shouldn't worry about this issue in the House because of the claim that this just hasn't been a factor on the House side. I think the discount question is central to the House as it was to the Senate. Frankly, I don't think the issue of lowest unit rate has already been decided. There's a consensus on that, certainly in Congress. The NAB has said they are not going to oppose it. Obviously, they prefer the Danforth version to this committee's version, but when we come down to it, at least at the congressional level, there's a consensus on low unit rate. And what this committee faces is the question of what is going to be done beyond that to try to contribute to dealing with this fundamental problem. Mr. Scheuer said he was discouraged. I don't think he should be, nor do I think he can afford to be. I mean, you have a political breakdown on your hands, and the country does. We've got a huge problem, and dealing with the problem is not a question of figuring out a solution, it's a question of political will. This institution has done things before that they thought the public did not like. They passed the pay raise. Now, the fact of the matter is I don't believe that any anyone has come to any of your doors, I don't think you've been getting a lot of mail screaming about the need to repeal the presidential public financing system. That has been on the books since 1975.
I'm sure they gave you 5 minutes to testify earlier. Let me see if I can focus in on Mr. Fritz. Mr. Fritz, it's my understanding the broadcasters have decided that the only provisions of any bills that are outstanding right now in the campaign finance reform area that they can support is S521. Is that correct?
We would prefer S521 and the things embodied.
S521 basically takes the lowest unit rate and adds to it non-preemptible status.
That's correct.
And beyond that, you're not prepared to go any farther in suggesting any changes that could be made.
It changes the fundamental deal.
But, I mean, I just want to get the parameters. That's as far as the broadcasters are prepared to go at this point.
Sir.
Explain for me, if you could, how most broadcasters deal with independent expenditures. Do they give them the lowest lowest unit rate as an independent expenditure, or are they considered commercial expenditure?
It's an excellent question, and one that broadcasters don't focus on, but under the law, independent expenditures are not entitled to lowest unit charge, but most broadcasters don't know that, and it goes across the board. Some broadcasters will give lowest unit charge to political campaigns, for example.
So, would the broadcasters support that same status, in other words, keeping them at a commercial status versus this status that would be in the S521 for candidates?
Well, I think, Congressman, that we're getting far afield.
No, I'm trying to figure out what the broadcasters are willing to put on the table. One of the things that we want to do is to see whether the broadcasters want to treat independent expenditures the same way as candidate expenditures.
It's a slippery slope. If you're going to give it to independent campaigns, what about issue ads? What about ballot issues?
That's
Where
what
do
I'm
you draw
asking.
the line? It's very difficult. S521 S521 gives the candidate fixed time for the lowest unit rate. That's better than the deal.
What are the broadcasters prepared to do with independent expenditures? I want to know what they're prepared to, what status are they prepared to support?
I think we're prepared to not oppose the 521 that's on the table today.
So, what you're telling me is the broadcasters would apply the same parameters of S521 to independent, which means that an independent expenditure would walk in the same as a candidate.
No, I think the independent expenditure would not get the same status as a candidate the way it is today. Under the law...
No, under today, but you just told me you're prepared to give independent expenditures the status of 521.
I think some broadcasters do that today, but under the law that's not required.
Okay, let me
it's so confusing, and I think that's the point that you make.
If the broadcasters don't have a position on this, that's safe to say we don't have one. We'll get back with you, Congressman. Let's pin this down. The broadcasters support 521 as a way to give candidates non-preemptible lowest unit rate.
Candidates.
Candidates, right.
Themselves.
Is it the position of the broadcasters to give that same status to independent expenditures?
We've not taken a position on that.
Okay. So at this point, you'll get back with us?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I think that concludes my questions. I might just say that I think these hearings have been very important because I believe that this element of the campaign finance reform bill may be the biggest element and hurdle that we have to get over. As many of my colleagues who preceded me have outlined, this being such a major expenditure of the entire campaign, dealing with this in a way that satisfies all the various factions that are involved may in many ways take down some of the barriers. I would also say one other thing, and it's kind of playing off what Mr. Richardson said, even though it's not directly related to broadcasting. Eventually, the American public, if they are concerned about the statements of the President last night about the inability of Congress to act within 100 days on certain pieces of legislation or to act at all, are going to have to come to grips with the fact that one of the reasons we are slow is the amount of money that is in the system that in some ways has gridlocked the entire legislative process. Norm Ornstein put it best, we have got to figure out a way to get disinterested money infused into the system. What all of us must work for as members of Congress, the public, and interested parties is to figure out a way to do that as satisfactory to everyone, and I look forward to working with the committee on that.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. And I'd just like to ask one final question before we wrap up, and I'm going to ask each of you as well to give us your 1-minute summary as to what you want us to include in any legislation we pass, and what new ideas as well you'd like us to put on the table. This whole notion of the change brought about by introduction of new technologies over the last 10 years or so that Mr. Ornstein referred to in his opening is something that we do have to take legislative note of as we move forward. That is, that as the networks and the network affiliates have dropped from an average of a 23 or 24 share, a Nielsen rating in the year 1980, down to 12s and 13s this year. It's fairly easy to prognosticate that 10 years from today we'll be looking at 6 and 7 ratings, given the proliferation of new technologies, alternatives that viewers have to get their video entertainment, their news, their sports from other areas. Just this past week, Stanley Hubbard has announced his joint venture with Hughes that will construct a national direct broadcast satellite network that will compete with cable and with broadcasting as an alternative means of viewers getting access to information. So the question that I have is this. We know on this subcommittee that there has been a dramatic reduction in the amount of advertising revenues that have been flowing into TV stations across the country, radio stations as well. And we know that we have a tension, which is that as these advertising revenues decline, there are, in fact, less resources left for the broadcasters to provide for the public affairs, informational programming that has served our nation well over the last 50 to 60 years. And in fact, more and more, we have a two-class system of information in our country, where those who can afford to pay for it will receive high-quality information on their cable, on their pay-per-view, on their satellite system, and we will continue to see a diminution and erosion of the overall quality of information on the traditional free over-the-air broadcast system. Now, to some extent, this issue does play into it. That is, the extent to which we ask the broadcasters to contribute their time, the time that would otherwise be available for other purposes to generate revenues, as a further contributing factor to the acceleration of this trend. And there is some tension here. And I understand that it's in the broadcaster's interest to focus upon that and to, as a result, try to minimize the burdens which we place upon them over the coming decade and any laws that we may pass this year or next. What I'd ask you, Mr. Wertheimer, is if you could give us your sense of this issue, the tension that does exist here, without question, in an era of declining advertising revenues for broadcasters, the impact that it has upon, as a result, the bottom 30 or 40 percentile, the blue-collar workers, in terms of the access they'll have to the high-quality information which the cable and pay-per-view and satellite purchases will be able to have access to.
Well, I would start off by saying that I don't think this is a question of asking the broadcasters to contribute part of their time. I think this is a question that starts from the premise that the public owns those airwaves. And what has to be figured out is, what are the responsibilities of those people who are licensed to use the airwaves? In that context, given the technological innovations and revolutions that are going on, given whatever financial issues that may be facing the broadcasters today that are somewhat different than they were 10 years ago or 5 years ago, we still face a crisis in our own country in the way our political system is working. And there's no one solution to that crisis. But it is simply a matter of fact that, well, I guess fact is the wrong word. I believe, and I think there's strong evidence, that the public is more and more disconnected from those who are governing it. There's an extraordinary turnoff on politics that shows up in turnout, in people's attitudes, and that the campaign finance system plays a central role in that, and a central role today in the fact that we don't have elections in the House of Representatives anymore, except for a few seats. And we have less and less in the Senate. Almost half the Senate races were, for all practical purposes, not financially contested. Given the fundamental problem we have in the breakdown of the political system and the need for reforming that system, and given the role that television plays today in the problems we have, we believe that it is, not only is it not asking too much, but that it's central, that part of solving this problem requires us to go back to look at the public airwaves and see what kind of different role they can play in promoting and carrying out the public dialogue in this country. And that, to us, leads us to conclude that it is appropriate to talk not just about lowest unit rate, but about discounted rates for limited time periods, because we're talking about for limited time periods, in a system of limited spending, so that you're not just adding to the problem. And I don't think the amounts of money that we're talking about here, yes, they may well be very important, but in the larger sense, in the larger context of what's going on in the broadcast industry, I don't think they're prohibitive, nor do I think they should be approached that way. I think you've got to approach this from the standpoint of where the problem lies today, and that this is part of the solution.
Mr. Fritz.
Mr. Chairman, Eddie Fritz testified before the Congress last month eloquently about the public interest obligations that broadcasters have. I think he articulated the tremendous amounts of time that are devoted to public issues of our day, including debates, including extensive news coverage, including public affairs programming across the board from radio to television. I don't think that that should be shunted aside. We do that. We take those obligations seriously under the public trusteeship model that the Communications Act is based on. What broadcasters require is simple, understandable rules. We're willing to give the Congress what it wants. We have to understand simply these rules are enormously confusing. In any particular fact pattern, 5 different communications lawyers in Washington can give you 5 different answers. Broadcasters don't want to have to call a $250 lawyer in Washington to get an answer on every single sale that they make. So we desperately want to comply with these extraordinarily complex rules. There is no sinister motive that broadcasters are out to soak candidates. I think that's the important point.
Thank you. And Mr. Ornstein, could you flesh out a little bit, perhaps, some of the recommendations which you may have for us in terms of how we should handle cable in this modern era, how we should handle satellite communications, so that as more and more Americans receive their communications from those news sources, we've tried to anticipate as best we can the kinds of responsibilities that they should shoulder.
Sure. Well, of course, the first thing is with caution. I think we have to recognize that to whatever degree we really do step in and regulate here, it's going to be very hard to regulate equally and to regulate a moving target. And one of the recommendations I would make to you, in lieu of my 1 minute at the end, I'd move ahead on on obviously the issue in which there is a consensus on low-cost preemptible time or lowest unit cost. Then I'd stop. And I would urge the subcommittee to prepare for a set of hearings at some point in the next year or so on how new technologies are going to affect politics. It's all the things we've talked about. It's also two-way television, which could have a profound and in many ways, I think, deleterious impact on the deliberative function of Congress and other representative institutions. I think, given your expertise and the efforts you've done in the past, that would be a very useful step to take, and do it before you do anything more. I am concerned, certainly, that we will use the ability to regulate the public airwaves in a fashion that will further disadvantage broadcasters compared to cable. It's an easy thing to do, and it would have some costs, and I don't want to go too far. At the same time, I have no objection whatsoever to making the broadcast industry broadly defined or narrowly defined pay some share of the costs of cleaning up the campaign system, given the enormous benefits that they've accrued from that system over the years. If they are in a temporary position of cash shortage in television stations, and we make some fee that's based on a proportion of revenues, and obviously the fee is less as revenues go down, it increases as they go up, and a small fee, I think, is perfectly acceptable under these circumstances. Going much further and going to really deep discounts, I'd be careful, and I'd want to look very, very carefully at what that might do to encourage people to get into this process who we don't particularly want in, who don't have the motives of trying to get elected to office, but have other things in mind.
Gotcha. So we'll then, at Mr. Ornstein's suggestion, have that statement serve as his final 1 minute set of recommendations to us. We'll now go to you, Mr. Fritz.
I just want to comment on one thing that Mr. Ornstein said. I'm not sure how much this Congress wants to really pass campaign reform legislation, but I would suggest that the quickest way to kill it is to attempt to pass an advertising tax of this nature.
Okay, thank you. And we'll give you the final 1 minute statement, Mr. Wertheimer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again for holding these hearings. I would submit to you that discounted TV is not the issue on which the broadcast industry is going to rise or fall, whether from a philosophical standpoint, a competitive standpoint, or an economic standpoint. I think if you were to propose free television time for campaigns as part of a spending limit system, you'd get overwhelming support in this country. People have, I think there'd be broad-based support from the public. Discounted TV is a smaller version of that. And I do not believe that this committee should stop at lowest unit rate. Now is the time to go forward as part of the overall campaign finance issue and deal with the issue of providing some discount. We support the discount in H.R. 1177 for a limited period of time in a 2-year election cycle. As part of the responsibility of the broadcast industry, I share the view that you should look at cable. We also support the accountability measures that have been talked about, such as requiring candidates to take responsibility for ads and other forms of disclosure. But we believe that you do have a central role to play as the campaign finance issue goes forward. It is going to go forward in the House this year, and we hope you will recommend steps above and beyond lowest unit rate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Wertheimer, and the rest of the panel. This is about as distinguished a group as we could possibly ever hope to assemble on this subject. We are going to be moving moving in concert with the work of Mr. Gadenson and the leadership of both parties, but we will move with our own sense of right or wrong in terms of what we think makes sense as well. And we're going to have to work very closely with the people at this table so that we stay close to you as we're moving forward. And I would invite you to work with our staff person, Howard Homanoff, on this issue as we're proceeding, so that we can have the kind of understanding of your interest in any particular provision so that it's fully accommodated or dealt with as we produce legislation out of this committee. So with that, we thank each of you, and to all of those who have been sitting here patiently for the last 4 hours. We apologize, but the importance of the issue, I think, demanded this kind of attention. The hearing is adjourned.
For more information on this panel on political advertising and campaign finance reform, write to the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee.
C-SPAN 2 proudly marks its 5th year telecasting live coverage of the U.S. Senate. C-SPAN 2 is part of the C-SPAN networks, privately funded to serve the public.